to quiet Chronicles. Set down for a little while the small decisions the day has been asking you to carry. This is a story about a man whose name became almost larger than his life, a general remembered for understanding that the most important part of war often happened before armies ever met. Sun Tzu stands in history like a figure seen through old bamboo and ink. He is famous across the world, quoted in boardrooms, classrooms, war colleges, and quiet private notebooks, yet the man himself remains difficult to hold clearly. Was he the General Sun Wu, serving the ambitious state of Wu in an age of broken kingdoms? Was he a single mind behind a short, severe book, or the name through which an entire age of strategy learned to speak? If you enjoy these long historical journeys, a like and subscribe helps Quiet Chronicles keep bringing full stories like this each week. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from and whether there is a person, topic, story, or era you would like us to cover next. Before the book became wisdom, before the name became legend, there was a world of rival courts, uncertain loyalties, and states fighting to survive. That is where the story begins. Chapter 1. A name from the age of broken states. Sun Tzu comes down through history with a fame that is strangely larger than the man himself. His name is known in places that have never studied the politics of ancient China, and his book is read by people who will never command an army. Yet, when the historian looks for the man behind that name, the figure becomes less solid. He is present in tradition, attached to a powerful text, remembered by later writers, and placed in the service of a rising state, but he does not stand before us with the clear outlines of a ruler whose reign was carved into bronze or a minister whose career filled the records of a court. The name most often given to him is Sun Wu. Sun Tzu is not exactly a personal name in the ordinary sense, but an honorific form meaning Master Sun, the way other Chinese thinkers came down to later ages as Confucius, Mencius, Mozi, or Han Fei. The title already tells us that the man was remembered less as a private person than as the bearer of a teaching, a family name, a courtesy of respect. A short military text and a handful of stories became the materials from which later generations built one of the most durable reputations in world history. His traditional world was the late spring and autumn period, an age when the Zhou dynasty still existed but no longer ruled China in the strong sense of that word. The Zhou kings remained sacred and ancient in title, seated at the center of a ritual order that had once given shape to the noble houses around them. Their authority still mattered in ceremonies, genealogies, titles, and the language of legitimacy. A ruler could still benefit from appearing loyal to Zhou tradition. But real power had traveled outward into the hands of regional states whose armies, ministers, and ambitions had grown too large to be contained by old forms. This was not yet imperial China. There was no single emperor ruling the whole land, no unified law code reaching from one frontier to another, no centralized bureaucracy able to make the great states obey. Instead, there were courts, Qi, Jin, Chu, Qin, Wu, Yue, Lu, Song, Zheng, and many others, each with its own rulers, lineages, rivalries, and remembered injuries. Envoys crossed between them with messages wrapped in ritual language. Marriages created temporary bonds. Oaths were sworn and broken. Alliances formed around fear, advantage, prestige, or revenge, and the older Zhou world remained present as a vocabulary of order even while the political reality moved away from it. For a strategist, such a world was fertile ground. War was not an interruption of politics, but one of the ways politics showed its shape. States fought over borders, succession disputes, revenge, hegemony, access to resources, and the right to command respect from weaker neighbors. A ruler who could not judge the strength of an enemy might lose his ancestral lands. A minister who misread a neighboring court might bring invasion closer. In that setting, the difference between patience and haste, between deception and clarity, between a long campaign and a short one, could decide whether a state endured for another generation. The spring and autumn period took its later name from the chronicle of the state of Lu, traditionally associated with the world of Confucius. That connection is useful, because Confucius lived not far from the traditional time assigned to Sun Tzu, though they belong to different kinds of memory. Confucius looked back to ritual, moral order, proper government, and the repair of human conduct through cultivated virtue. Sun Tzu's surviving voice, if the text may be called that, looks toward calculation, advantage, uncertainty, and the disciplined use of force. They were not opposites in some simple way. Both belonged to an age in which old authority had weakened, and thoughtful men tried to understand what could still give order to human affairs. The historical record does not give Sun Tzu the kind of early life that later biographers loved to invent for famous men. There is no secure childhood story, no preserved account of his parents, no formative scene in which the boy first sees a battlefield or studies under a named master. Tradition places him in Qi before his service in Wu, but the road between those 2 points is mostly empty. That emptiness should not be filled too quickly. In early Chinese history, silence in the record is itself a fact, and it asks for patience rather than decoration. Qi, the state from which he is often said to have come, had long prestige. It lay in the East, with a political culture tied to old noble houses and to earlier models of statecraft. Wu, where he enters the famous tradition, lay farther to the southeast, in a region often treated by the Central Plain states as less fully part of the old aristocratic heartland. That movement from Qi to Wu matters. It suggests a man whose knowledge could travel, and a court willing to use skill even when it came from outside familiar circles. A state on the edge of the older order could become unusually hungry for talent. The main ancient source for Sun Tzu's life is Sima Qian, the great Han Dynasty historian who wrote the records of the Grand Historian many centuries after the age he described. Sima Qian lived under the Han emperors, in a world already far removed from the loose interstate politics of spring and autumn China. He inherited stories, documents, court traditions, earlier writings, and names that had passed through the hands of many keepers of memory. His work is invaluable, but it is not the same thing as a contemporary diary. When he tells us of Sun Tzu, he is preserving a tradition that had already traveled. Sima Qian gives Sun Tzu a sharp entrance. He says that Sun Tzu's military writings came to the attention of King Heilu of Wu, and that the king summoned him to test whether the man who wrote so well about war could actually command. This is the famous doorway through which Sun Tzu enters historical imagination, not as a prince, not as a minister born to office, but as a man whose written understanding of warfare earns the curiosity of a ruler. A text comes before the public career. The book, or something like the book, is already part of the biography. That order is worth noticing. Many ancient figures are remembered because they acted first and were written about later. Sun Tzu is remembered partly because the writing itself becomes evidence of the man. King Heilu reads, or is said to read, and then wishes to see the principles tested. Whether every detail of the story occurred exactly as Sima Qian gives it is less important at this stage than what the story reveals about the memory attached to Sun Tzu. He was not remembered as a warrior moved by appetite for battle. He was remembered as someone whose authority came from method. The age itself was becoming more receptive to method. Earlier aristocratic warfare had placed great value on noble rank, chariot combat, ritualized conduct, and the personal honor of ruling houses. Those older habits did not vanish all at once, and they should not be dismissed as mere pageantry. They belonged to a world in which war was also a language of status. But the states were changing. Larger forces, harsher competition, longer campaigns, and more practical demands made old assumptions less reliable. When survival became more difficult, rulers grew more willing to listen to men who could speak of war as a problem of organization. Bronze vessels still carried ancestral memory in elite halls. Ritual music still marked ceremonies. Titles, sacrifices, and formal speech still mattered. Alongside those inherited forms, however, another kind of order was rising. The order of registers, commands, roads, grain, punishments, spies, terrain, and numbers. The ruler who prayed correctly but calculated badly could still lose his army. The minister who understood etiquette but ignored supply might see a campaign fail before battle began. In such a world, the strategist did not replace the ritual order. He exposed the limits of relying on it alone. Sun Tzu's fame rests on a book of only 13 chapters, a compact work when measured against the enormous reputation it later gained. Its sentences are spare, often severe, and concerned with judgment before action. It asks the ruler and commander to calculate, to know themselves and the enemy, to preserve strength where possible, to deceive where necessary, and to avoid the waste of prolonged war. The text does not read like the celebration of a man intoxicated by violence. Its coldness lies somewhere else, in its refusal to confuse courage with wisdom or movement with success. Yet the book cannot be removed from the violent world that made it meaningful. A manual on avoiding waste matters most where waste is common. A doctrine of calculation becomes powerful where miscalculation ruins states. To say that Sun Tzu valued winning before battle is not to say that his world was gentle. It was because war could consume men, grain, authority, and dynastic future that restraint became one of the harsh arts of survival. The calmness of the text belongs to a dangerous age, not to a peaceful one. The uncertainty around Sun Tzu has led some scholars to question whether the traditional Sun Wu wrote the text exactly as received, or whether the book grew through a later process of compilation and transmission. This question should be allowed to remain present without overwhelming the story. Ancient books often have lives longer and more layered than the men attached to them. A teaching may begin with one figure, gather editions, pass through schools, be edited by later hands, and still preserve a recognizable center of thought. The name Sun Tzu may therefore point both to a remembered man and to a tradition of strategic thinking that took shape around him. That is not a disappointment. In some ways, it makes the story richer. The historian does not find Sun Tzu standing alone in perfect light, but among courts, texts, later copyists, military reforms, state rivalries, and the careful memory of a civilization that preserved what it found useful. His outline is incomplete, but the incompleteness does not erase him. It places him where many ancient figures truly live, between record and remembrance, between the single life and the many generations that decided the life should not be forgotten. By the time later readers encountered Sun Tzu, the world of Wu had already vanished into history. The Zhou order had given way to the warring states to empire, and empire to its own cycles of order and fracture. Still, the small book remained. Generals read it, rulers cited it, commentators argued over it, and translators eventually carried it far beyond the language and landscape that produced it. The man grew harder to see, while the name became easier to recognize. So the story must begin with care. It cannot begin by pretending that Sun Tzu is as fully documented as Caesar or Napoleon. It begins instead with a name, a state, a historian, a book, and an age in which power had broken loose from old centers. The Zhou kings still possessed their ancient dignity, but the future belonged increasingly to rulers who could find sharper servants, move armies more carefully, and survive the judgment of neighboring states. Out of that world came the tradition of Sun Wu, and to understand why a man like him could matter, the road now turns toward Qi, Wu, and the restless world before the book. Chapter 2: Qi, Wu, and the world before the book. Qi stood in the east with an old authority around its name. Its rulers traced their legitimacy through the grand memory of the early Zhou settlement, and its place near the Shandong Peninsula gave it access to salt, fish, trade, and the cultural habits of a state that had long been counted among the important powers of the Chinese world. To come from Qi, as tradition says Sun Tzu did, was to come from a region where statecraft had already acquired age and prestige. The courtly language of ancestry, sacrifice, office, and rank had weight there, and a man trained in such a world would have known that power was never only a matter of weapons. Wu was different. It lay farther south and east, near the lower Yangtze region, in lands that many Central Plain states regarded as partly outside the old heart of Zhou civilization. Its rulers eventually claimed noble connections of their own, but in the imagination of northern courts, Wu could appear rougher, more distant, and less bound by inherited ritual polish. That distance may have been one of its advantages. A state not fully enclosed by older aristocratic expectations could move with fewer habits pressing on its decisions, especially when its rulers wanted to rise quickly among more established rivals. The geography of Wu mattered in ways that shaped its politics. Rivers, wetlands, lakes, and southern routes made movement different from the chariot-friendly plains farther north. The lower Yangtze world asked armies to think about water, boats, crossings, supply lines, and the difficulty of holding men together in country that did not always reward the older forms of war. A northern chariot aristocrat might see unfamiliar terrain. A ruler of Wu saw routes, obstacles, and possibilities. The land itself pressed military imagination into different forms. Between Qi and Wu lay more than distance. There was a difference in political age, cultural reputation, and strategic need. Qi had the weight of an older state. Wu had the hunger of a rising one. A man moving from Qi into Wu, whether Sun Tzu himself or the type of skilled outsider his tradition represents, crossed from a world with established memory into a court eager to convert knowledge into power. That kind of movement became increasingly common as the Zhou order weakened. Talent began to travel where birth alone could no longer settle the fate of states. Wu's rise cannot be separated from King Helu, the ruler traditionally associated with Sun Tzu's service. Helu came to power in the late 6th century BCE, at a time when Wu was becoming more aggressive, more organized, and more willing to challenge Chu, the enormous southern state that had long cast its shadow across the region. His reign belongs to the period when Wu stopped being merely peripheral in the eyes of its rivals and became one of the states that had to be calculated into every serious plan. Ambition, in Helu's case, required more than bravery. It required advisors who could make a frontier power behave like a disciplined state. One of those advisors was Wu Zishu, whose life entered Wu through loss and exile. He had been born into Chu's political world, but court danger forced him out of it, and tradition remembered his flight with the dark clarity often given to men who crossed from one loyalty into another. His father and brother were killed under Chu authority, and Wu Zixu's hatred of Chu became one of the human forces behind Wu's later campaigns. The story is personal, but not merely personal. Exiled men often carried knowledge with them: maps of court behavior, memories of factions, names of officials, and an understanding of how a rival state breathed behind its ceremonial face. Wu Zishu's arrival in Wu gave Helu something more useful than anger. It gave him a counselor who knew Chu from within, a man whose grievance had sharpened rather than erased his political intelligence. In the world of rival courts, an exile could be dangerous because he belonged to two places at once: the state that had cast him out and the state that might use him. He understood the language of his old home, the habits of its ministers, the pride of its ruling house, and the points where resentment might open into policy. Such men were not merely refugees. They were living archives of another court. Sun Tzu's traditional arrival belongs beside this pattern. Whether he came directly from Qi because of reputation, recommendation, or some lost connection, the larger point remains steady. Wu was becoming a court where outside knowledge mattered. A ruler who wanted to fight Chu could not rely only on inherited local strength. He needed people who understood wider politics, disciplined command, and the calculation of advantage. In that setting, a military thinker from another state could become valuable precisely because he was not formed entirely inside Wu's own assumptions. The late spring and autumn world made such service both possible and risky. Ministers, strategists, ritual experts, and persuaders moved among courts, but every movement carried suspicion. A ruler welcomed foreign talent when it served him, yet he also had to wonder where the man's deepest loyalty lay. An advisor who spoke too plainly could offend the powerful. One who spoke too softly could become useless. The safest court servant was often the least honest, while the most valuable one might be the most difficult to keep near power. Still, rulers needed them. The old network of noble families could not answer every military problem. States were larger than before, and the demands on government had grown more severe. Armies needed command systems. Campaigns needed supply. Diplomacy required memory of old promises and fresh betrayals. A king who wished to become a hegemon needed men who could turn desire into procedure. Helu's Wu, rising beside stronger and older neighbors, had to learn faster than the states that already possessed prestige. Chu was the great object in the distance. It was not a minor enemy that could be absorbed by a single raid or humbled by one border fight. Chu had long traditions of rule, large territory, its own ritual and political culture, and a scale that made it both impressive and unwieldy. Northern states sometimes treated Chu as culturally different, yet they could not dismiss its power. For Wu, the struggle with Chu was therefore a test of state maturity. To challenge Chu meant entering the politics of great powers, where courage without structure would not be enough. The presence of Yu added another pressure. Yue lay near Wu and would eventually become the enemy that destroyed it. But in the earlier movement of the story, it appears as part of the unsettled southern field in which no victory could be treated as final. Wu looked toward Chu, while Yu watched Wu. This triangular world gave strategy a layered quality. A ruler planning one war had to ask what a second neighbor might do while the first war consumed attention. In such a landscape, the wise commander studied not only the enemy before him, but the enemy waiting beside him. The world before the art of war was therefore already full of the problems the book would later name. It contained rulers who needed to judge when to fight and when to wait. It contained ministers who carried private injuries into public policy. It contained states that had to understand terrain, supply, morale, rank, deception, and alliance. It contained older ritual language and newer forms of administrative calculation. The text did not descend into an empty world. It gathered the pressures of a world already learning that survival required disciplined thought. A court such as Helu's would have valued a man who could make war seem less like fury and more like order. That does not mean Wu was gentle, or that Sun Wu's principles were humane in the modern sense. Ancient strategy could be severe because it placed the state above the individual life. Yet severity and recklessness are not the same. The tradition surrounding Sun Tzu insists that command begins with clarity, that victory must be prepared before it is attempted, and that an army is too costly an instrument to be moved by vanity. King Helu's ambition gave these ideas a political home. Wu Zishu's grievance gave them a direction. Chu's size gave them a formidable test. Yue's nearness gave them an unseen limit. Around these elements, Sun Wu enters the story not as a solitary sage descending from nowhere, but as one more figure in a wider movement of talent, rivalry, exile, and calculation. His importance grows because the age had created the exact need his name would come to answer. Before the famous palace test, before the campaigns against Chu, before the 13 chapters hardened into one of the world's best-known books on strategy, there was this restless geography of states and advisors. Qi carried old prestige. Wu carried new hunger. Chu carried weight and danger. Yu waited close enough to matter. Through that field of forces, the figure remembered as Sun Wu made his way toward King Heliu's court, where the written art of command would be asked to prove itself in front of a ruler who wanted more than elegant words. Chapter 3: King Helu and the Test of Command. King Heliu enters the story as the ruler who turned curiosity into appointment. In the tradition preserved by Sima Qian, he had read Sun Wu's military writings before he met the man himself, and that detail gives the episode its special shape. Sun Wu did not first appear as a warrior covered in the reputation of campaigns. He appeared as a thinker whose written method had reached a king ambitious enough to test whether method could become command. Heliu's court was not a place where theory alone could satisfy anyone for long. Wu stood near powerful enemies, above all Chu, and a ruler who wished to enlarge his state needed more than impressive sentences about war. He needed proof that a man who could write of discipline could impose it, that a man who spoke of order could create it among people who had no habit of obeying him. Ancient rulers lived among advisors, persuaders, diviners, envoys, and soldiers, and every one of them could sound convincing for a little while. The harder test was whether words could survive contact with authority. Sima Qian's account says that Heliu asked Sun Wu whether his principles could be applied to women. The question was not asked in a modern world of military professionalism, and it should not be torn away from the setting that produced it. In the story, the king was testing the universality of command, asking whether Sun Wu's rules depended on trained soldiers or whether they could bring order even to people outside the normal military sphere. Sun Wu answered that they could. The courtly test began there, with confidence spoken before a king. The women of the palace were brought forward and divided into 2 companies. Sun Wu placed 2 of the king's favorites at their head, giving them responsibility over the others. This detail matters because it brings affection, rank, and royal privilege into direct contact with military rule. In an ordinary court setting, the king's favorites belonged close to his personal world, protected by intimacy and status. In Sun Wu's demonstration, they became officers inside a chain of command. Their new position made them responsible not for pleasing the king, but for transmitting orders. Sun Wu then explained the commands. According to the logic of the story, discipline could not begin with punishment. It had to begin with clarity. The commander was responsible for making the order understandable before judging obedience, because confusion belongs first to the person who commands. He explained what the women were to do when the drum sounded and when the directions were given. Front, back, left, right, movement, attention, and response had to be made plain before failure could be called disobedience. When the orders were first given, the women laughed. The scene has often been remembered for its severity, but the laughter is just as important as the later outcome. It shows that the palace had not yet accepted the transformation Sun Wu was trying to impose. To the women, perhaps, the exercise still belonged to the world of performance, court amusement, or royal experiment. To Sun Wu, it belonged already to the world of command. 2 different understandings of the same moment stood briefly beside each other. Sun Wu did not immediately punish them. He said, in Sima Qian's account, that if orders were not clear and commands not understood, the fault lay with the general. The principle is cold, but not careless. It places the first burden on leadership. A commander cannot hide behind the failure of subordinates if he has not made his intention intelligible. In that first correction, the story gives Sun Wu a form of fairness before it gives him severity, and the fairness makes the severity more absolute when it arrives. He explained the commands again. This second instruction removed the excuse of confusion, at least within the moral world of the anecdote. Once the drums sounded and the orders were repeated, the women laughed again. At that point, Sun Tzu declared that if the commands were clear and still not followed, the fault belonged to the officers. Responsibility moved down the chain. The two women placed at the head of the companies were no longer merely royal favorites. They were commanders who had failed to make command real. The king objected when Sun Tzu ordered the punishment of the two women. He Lu had wanted a demonstration, but the demonstration had reached into the protected space of his own pleasure and preference. In that moment, the story becomes less about the women than about the ruler. A king may desire discipline in his army, but discipline has meaning only if it stands above personal exception. Sun Tzu's answer, as Sima Qian gives it, was that once a general had received his commission, there were commands of the ruler he need not accept while carrying out military duty. This was a dangerous claim to place in the mouth of any servant. Ancient Chinese political thought did not treat ministers and generals as free agents in the modern sense. Their authority came from the ruler, and their lives could be taken by the ruler. Yet the story grants the general a limited sphere of command in which military order must not be undone by palace emotion. It does not make Sun Tzu independent of He Lu. It shows that the king's desire for an effective army required him to tolerate a kind of obedience that could feel for a moment like resistance. The punishments were carried out. The physical details do not need to be dwelt upon, and the old story itself uses the outcome to turn back toward command. After the two leaders were removed, new officers were appointed, and the companies responded perfectly to the orders. They turned as instructed, moved with precision, and no longer treated the exercise as a game. Sun Tzu then sent word that the troops were ready for inspection, but He Lu, grieving the loss of his favorites, no longer wished to come down and watch. Sun Tzu's reply was severe in another way. He said that the king loved the words of war, but not their reality. This is one of the central observations hidden inside the anecdote. Rulers often desired the benefits of discipline without the cost of discipline. They wanted victory, prestige, obedient troops, and powerful generals, but they did not always want the hard impersonality that made those things possible. Sun Tzu's test forced He Lu to encounter the difference between admiring strategy and submitting to its demands. The account ends with He Lu recognizing Sun Tzu's ability and appointing him as a general. Whether the episode happened exactly as told, whether it was shaped by later moral storytelling, or whether it preserves a rough memory dressed in dramatic form, it became the most famous biographical scene attached to Sun Tzu. It tells later readers what kind of figure they were meant to see. Not a reckless fighter, not a court flatterer, not a man who made war sound noble, a commander whose first concern was the creation of order. There is discomfort in the story, and the discomfort should not be smoothed away. It presents authority in a harsh form, and it uses the palace women as instruments in a lesson about male command, royal power, and military discipline. A modern reader may notice that more quickly than an ancient compiler expected, but the historian's task is not to make the story gentler than it is. It is to understand why this was the story that survived and what it reveals about the world that preserved Sun Tzu's name. The lesson Sima Qian wanted to transmit was not about cruelty for its own sake. It was about the chain of responsibility. Orders must be clear. Officers must be accountable. The ruler must not undo command for private reasons. A general entrusted with war must be allowed to enforce the system that makes war controllable. In the age of competing states, where armies could decide the fate of ruling houses, these ideas were not abstractions. They belonged to the survival of states. He Lu's acceptance of Sun Tzu marks the point where writing becomes office. The man whose treatise had attracted royal interest now enters the political and military machinery of Wu. Beside him, in the wider story, stood Wu Zhihu, the exiled minister whose hatred of Chu and knowledge of its court gave Wu another kind of weapon. Around them was a state eager to rise, a ruler willing to test harsh talent, and a southern world in which great campaigns were becoming possible. The palace test, then, is not merely a strange anecdote placed before the real history begins. It is the doorway into the kind of command that Wu would need. A state could not challenge Chu through ambition alone. It required discipline, hierarchy, reliable signals, obedient officers, and rulers who understood that war was not a performance staged for their pleasure. Sun Wu's demonstration, remembered through Sima Qian's spare and unsettling account, turned those principles into a scene that later centuries could not forget. After Helu accepted him, the tradition moves from court experiment toward military organization. The question was no longer whether Sun Wu could make an argument about command. The question was whether Wu itself could become the sort of state that his principles required, ordered enough to move, patient enough to calculate, and hard enough to keep discipline when ambition finally turned toward Chu. Chapter 4. The Army That Learned to Move as One. After the test before King Helu, Sun Wu's story leaves the enclosed world of the palace and enters the larger machinery of the state. A ruler could be impressed by discipline in a controlled demonstration, but Wu's ambitions required something more durable than an anecdote. The problem was not merely whether one man could give an order and be obeyed. The problem was whether a kingdom could turn scattered human strength into a force that moved, waited, listened, struck, halted, and endured according to command. Wu had reasons to learn this quickly. It stood near powerful rivals, and its greatest target, Chu, was not a weak neighbor waiting to be frightened by reputation. Chu had land, memory, armies, court traditions, and the scale of an old southern power. To challenge it, Wu needed more than the courage of a king or the bitterness of an exile like Wu Zixiu. It needed an army that could carry political intention across distance, through terrain and into danger without losing the shape imposed on it by command. An army in the world of Sun Tzu was never only men with weapons. It was also food, timing, signals, punishments, rewards, roads, boats, officers, families waiting behind, and fields that had lost workers for the season. The ruler saw soldiers assembled, but the state had already been moving before they gathered. Grain had to be collected and carried. Men had to be counted. Orders had to pass from court to commander, from commander to officers, from officers to units, and from units into the bodies of people who might be afraid, tired, uncertain, or far from home. This is why discipline occupies such a hard place in the Sun Tzu tradition. Discipline was not an ornament of command. It was the method by which the ruler's will survived distance. A king might decide on war inside a hall, but a decision made at court was useless if it dissolved on the road, in a camp, at a river crossing, or in the confusion of a battlefield. The art of command lay in keeping intention recognizable after it had passed through many hands. Drums and flags mattered because the human voice could not rule an army once the army spread out. Sound and sight became instruments of authority. A drum could call movement, mark rhythm, or signal change. Flags could show direction, formation, or identity across a field where dust, distance, and fear made ordinary speech insufficient. These were not decorative objects in the military world. They were the language by which command traveled when no single officer could be heard. For Wu, the problem of movement was sharpened by geography. The lower Yangtze region did not always offer the open spaces favored by older chariot warfare. Rivers, wetlands, lakes, and narrow passages forced armies to think in terms of crossings, boats, banks, and supply routes that could not be treated as simple roads. A formation that looked strong in one landscape could become clumsy in another. Terrain was not a background to war. It was one of the silent powers shaping every plan. Older aristocratic warfare had placed great honor on the chariot. In the central plain imagination, the chariot carried nobles into battle, displayed rank, and connected war with the social order of elite houses. But the centuries around Sun Tzu saw warfare become broader and more demanding. Infantry grew in importance. Larger bodies of men required systems that did not depend only on aristocratic presence. A state that could organize common soldiers well could become more dangerous than a state that relied too heavily on noble prestige. The shift did not happen in one clean moment. Chariots did not vanish all at once, and aristocratic values continued to shape the way men imagined honor and command. Yet military necessity kept pressing against inherited form. A ruler who wanted results had to care less about how war ought to look, and more about how it could be made to work. In that pressure, the world of the art of war becomes easier to understand. It belongs to a period when success increasingly depended on systems rather than display. Sun Tzu's traditional importance rests partly on this movement from personal bravery toward organized effectiveness. The text attached to his name is deeply interested in order, how the commander judges, how troops are managed, how rewards and punishments are used, how the enemy is drawn into disadvantage, and how the state avoids exhausting itself. These concerns fit a world in which armies had become too large and costly to be treated as the private instruments of noble pride. The army had to become a disciplined extension of state calculation. King Heliu's court needed that kind of extension. Ambition alone could not hold men together through a campaign against Chu. Wu Zishu's knowledge of Chu could guide policy, and Heliu's authority could authorize action. But the army itself had to become reliable enough to carry both. A ruler may choose the enemy. An advisor may explain the opportunity. The soldiers, officers, carts, boats, grain, drums, and flags must then carry the decision into the world where choice becomes consequence. A command drill, in this setting, was more than practice. It trained bodies to respond before confusion took hold. The first lesson was not glory, but recognition. Which sound meant movement, which sign meant halt, which direction belonged to which unit, which officer had authority, and what failure would cost. Such instruction could seem simple only to someone far from the difficulty of making many people obey one rhythm. The army that moved as one had been taught to reduce uncertainty before danger arrived. The human burden behind this order should not be forgotten. Soldiers were not abstractions. They were men drawn from households, villages, lineages, and fields. Their absence changed harvests and families. Their feeding required grain that someone had grown, measured, transported, and guarded. A campaign that lasted too long did not merely tire the army. It pressed on the state behind the army, reaching into storehouses, roads, labor obligations, and the patience of the people who supplied it. That pressure helps explain why the art of war treats prolonged conflict with suspicion. A careless reader might imagine that a famous book on war would delight in battle, but the text returns again and again to cost. Speed, deception, preparation, and the breaking of resistance are valuable because time eats strength. The longer a campaign continues, the more carts break, grain disappears, men sicken, officers quarrel, and neighboring states reconsider their opportunities. War was a state action, and every state action had a limit. Inside Wu, discipline therefore served more than battlefield order. It protected the political project of the ruler. If Heliu wished to challenge Chu, he needed an instrument that did not consume itself before reaching its purpose. Disorder wasted food, delayed movement, weakened morale, and invited enemies to wait. Order preserved force. It allowed a smaller or rising state to behave as if its strength were greater than its raw numbers, because well-directed strength often mattered more than size alone. This was the practical world in which Sun Tzu's reputation made sense. The palace test had shown command in miniature, but the army required command at scale. Instead of 2 companies standing before a ruler, there were units moving across real country, officers receiving orders under pressure, and supplies stretched along routes that could be threatened or delayed. The same principle held, though the world around it had widened. Commands had to be clear, responsibility had to be assigned, and the ruler's desire had to become a structure others could follow. Wu's military rise came from the meeting of several forces. Helu offered kingship and ambition. Wu Zishu brought grievance, counsel, and knowledge of Chu. Sun Tzu, in the tradition, brought the art of disciplined calculation. Geography forced adaptation, and rivalry made delay dangerous. When these elements gathered, Wu began to appear not as a distant southern state of limited consequence, but as a power capable of frightening older and larger neighbors. The army that learned to move as one was therefore also a state learning to think as one. Court ambition, ministerial advice, military discipline, and logistical endurance had to be tied together tightly enough to survive the march toward Chu. Behind the later fame of Sun Tzu's principles lay this harder administrative reality. No strategy could matter unless men could be fed, ordered, signaled, restrained, and moved. Once Wu began to understand that, war became less an outburst of royal ambition and more a costly instrument to be used with care, which leads naturally into the question at the center of Sun Tzu's thought: how to win without wasting the state that sought victory. Chapter 5: War Without Waste. Not every ancient war book celebrates battle. Some texts praise courage, some preserve heroic names, and some turn violence into the language of glory. The work attached to Sun Tzu moves in a colder direction. It begins from the recognition that war is costly before it is impressive, and that a ruler who mistakes movement for success may damage his own state before the enemy has been properly touched. Wu's ambitions against Chu make that thought more than a general principle. A state preparing for a major campaign could not pretend that armies appeared without burden. Men had to be taken from fields and households. Grain had to be gathered into storehouses, measured out, loaded, guarded, and moved. Carts wore down. Boats needed crews. Officers needed authority over men who might be marching farther than they had ever traveled. In the art of war, calculation comes before action. The commander is asked to weigh conditions before he moves, and the ruler is asked to understand that a campaign is not merely a declaration of will. The text speaks of estimates, comparisons, advantages, dangers, and the conditions that make victory likely or ruinous. This is one reason it has survived so long. Its tone does not flatter the ruler's desire to appear strong. It asks whether strength has been measured correctly. The old language of temple calculations belongs here. Before armies moved, rulers and advisors compared factors that could not be ignored: the ruler's authority, the commander's ability, the order within the army, the conditions of terrain, the timing of seasons, and the discipline by which men obeyed. The temple in this sense was not merely a sacred setting apart from politics. It was a place where the state's highest purposes and most dangerous decisions came near each other. War had to be imagined fully before it was released. Such calculation did not make war gentle. It made war deliberate. Sun Tzu's strategic world assumes deception, pressure, surprise, and the use of fear when useful. Yet it also treats carelessness as one of the great enemies of command. The reckless ruler and the vain general may do the enemy's work for him by exhausting their own side. A badly chosen campaign can weaken a state even if no enemy general shows unusual brilliance. Waste has its own momentum. The cost of prolonged war appears again and again in the tradition because the ancient state was not infinitely elastic. Grain could not be wished into existence. Labor taken from agriculture had consequences. Long-distance movements strained animals, vehicles, roads, and local populations expected to supply the army. When troops remained in the field too long, the campaign began to feed upon the country that had sent it. The ruler's ambition returned home as scarcity, fatigue, and resentment. Sun Tzu's preference for speed must be understood against that background. Speed was not excitement. It was preservation. A fast campaign could keep costs within bounds, reduce the time given to enemies and allies to adjust, and prevent the state from bleeding itself in slow motion. Delay favored uncertainty. It gave rival courts time to reconsider their loyalties, gave spies time to carry reports, gave weather and hunger time to interfere with plans. In war, time itself became an expense. For a rising state such as Wu, this mattered even more. Wu wanted to challenge a larger and older power in Chu, but a bold campaign could become ruinous if it stretched beyond the state's capacity. Liu needed victory, yet he also needed Wu to remain strong after victory. Wu Zixu might understand Chu's weaknesses, and Sun Wu might offer a doctrine of disciplined command, but neither counsel nor doctrine could remove the arithmetic of grain, distance, morale, and time. Strategy had to protect the future as well as win the present. This is where the phrase, often reduced to winning without fighting, must be handled with care. The idea is not a dream of bloodless politics, nor a promise that conflict can always be escaped. It means that the highest form of success lies in breaking the enemy's plan, alliances, confidence, or position before armies are forced into the most expensive form of decision. Battle may still come, but battle is not treated as the proof of strategic genius. It is often the sign that other forms of pressure have not been enough. A commander who can take a city only after destroying it has gained a damaged prize. A ruler who conquers land that has been emptied, burned, or embittered may inherit weakness rather than strength. Sun Tzu's text understands that victory has quality as well as fact. There is victory that enlarges a state, and victory that leaves it exhausted. There is victory that produces obedience, and victory that plants the conditions of future revolt. The best outcome is the one that leaves the winner able to use what has been won. Captured enemy resources therefore matter in the text's practical imagination. Enemy grain, enemy equipment, enemy strength turned to one's own purpose. These were not merely spoils in a heroic tale. They were ways to reduce the burden on the attacking state. The army that fed only from distant home supplies became more fragile with every mile. The army that could use what the enemy had gathered shortened the chain of strain behind it. This was strategy at the level of material survival. The same logic shaped Sun Tzu's treatment of deception. Deception was not a flourish added to battle for cleverness. It was a way of disturbing the enemy's calculation while protecting one's own. To appear weak when strong, distant when near, inactive when prepared, or disordered when controlled was to make the enemy spend thought and force in the wrong direction. The aim was not drama, it was imbalance. If the enemy could be made to move badly, the cost of victory might fall before battle reached its harshest form. A court preparing for campaign would have understood these ideas through pressure rather than abstraction. Messengers came and went. Reports from borders had to be judged. Storehouses were inspected. Officers argued over roads, timing, weather, and the reliability of allied promises. A ruler listening to such counsel was not merely asking whether he wished to fight. He was asking whether the state could bear the shape his wish would take once it became action. The wise advisor made desire answerable to circumstance. Sun Wu's traditional value to Liu rests on this discipline of circumstance. He did not offer war as royal theatre. He offered a way to make violence serve policy without consuming the power that ordered it. That is why the palace test, for all its severity, leads naturally into the book's larger restraint. The same mind that insists on obedience inside command also insists that command itself must not be squandered. Authority exists to direct force, but force used without calculation becomes one more danger to the ruler who releases it. There is an austerity in this view. Sun Tzu does not ask the ruler to be merciful in the language of compassion. He asks him to be intelligent in the language of survival. Yet, in the world of ancient war, that intelligence could reduce suffering precisely because it distrusted unnecessary struggle. A campaign avoided, shortened, or settled through broken alliances was not gentle in motive, but it could be less ruinous in result. The text's restraint comes from severity, looking carefully at cost. Wu's coming war with Chu would require all of this. It would require knowledge of terrain, discipline in movement, and judgment about when Chu's size could be turned against itself. It would require Helu to listen to advisors whose usefulness came from calculation rather than flattery. It would require an army able to move quickly, preserve its strength, and strike where the enemy's confidence had already begun to loosen. War without waste did not mean war without danger. It meant danger approached with arithmetic. The deeper one moves into Sun Tzu's thought, the more apparent it becomes that he treats ignorance as another form of waste. A ruler wastes men when he sends them forward without knowing enough. A commander wastes time when he moves through terrain he has not studied. A state wastes strength when it fights an enemy whose alliances, supplies, intentions, and fears remain unclear. To preserve force, one must first preserve attention. The next part of the story therefore turns toward the hidden side of command: spies, signs, terrain, reports, and the quiet labor of knowing the shape of victory before the army arrives. Chapter 6: Spies, Signs, and the Hidden Shape of Victory. Information sits near the heart of Sun Tzu's world. A ruler might possess brave troops, a commander might understand discipline, and a state might gather grain enough for a campaign, yet all of that strength could be misused if it moved through ignorance. Armies did not enter empty space. They entered country shaped by roads, rivers, hills, rival villages, guarded passes, false reports, fearful allies, and enemies who were also watching. The commander, in the art of war, is never allowed the comfort of assuming that things are as they appear. Distance can be misread. Weakness can be displayed as bait. Silence can cover preparation. Activity can conceal fear. The visible army is only one part of the situation, and the commander who sees only what is openly shown already stands behind the one who has learned to read what is hidden. Ancient warfare made this need for knowledge severe. Messages traveled by human movement, not by instant signal across a settled network. Roads were uneven in reliability. Weather could change a plan before the enemy did. A bridge, a ford, a storehouse, a narrow pass, or a local guide might matter more than the number of men named in a royal report. Command depended on knowing where force could actually move, not merely where a ruler wished it to move. Sun Tzu's attention to spies belongs to this same practical world. The final chapter of The Art of War gives unusual weight to the use of agents, and it does so because knowledge is treated as a state resource. To spend large sums on armies while refusing to spend on information would be, in the logic of the text, a terrible misjudgment. War was too expensive to be guided by guesses. The text names several kinds of spies, each with a different function in the movement of information. Local spies came from the enemy's own country and knew its roads, households, officials, and habits. Inward spies came from within the enemy's administration. Converted spies were enemy agents turned to one's own use. Doomed spies carried false information intended to be discovered. Surviving spies returned with reports from the enemy's side. The categories are severe, but they show how carefully the text understood the many paths by which knowledge could travel. These were not romantic figures in dark corners of a modern imagination. They belonged to the ordinary risks of ancient statecraft. A border village might know which roads flooded after rain. A clerk might know how much grain had been stored. A disgruntled officer might understand the mood of a camp. A captured messenger might become useful in more than one direction. Information moved through people, and people moved through loyalties that fear, money, grievance, ambition, or survival could alter. For a state such as Wu, intelligence could help answer questions that raw confidence could not. How prepared was Chu? Which routes were watched? Which commanders held real authority? Which allies might remain loyal once pressure came? Where could an army cross without losing time? Which city would resist because it trusted relief, and which might yield because its officials already doubted the court? Terrain formed another part of this hidden shape. The art of war speaks repeatedly of ground, distance, height, narrowness, openness, danger, and advantage. The commander was expected to know how land altered men. A high position, a constricted route, a marshy region, a river crossing, or a long road through poor supply country could change the value of an army before it ever reached the enemy. Terrain did not merely receive events, it participated in them. The lower Yangtze region made that lesson especially vivid. Rivers and wetlands could slow movement, divide forces, or shelter approach. Boats could turn water from obstacle into road. A crossing badly chosen could scatter order, while a crossing prepared with care could place an army where the enemy did not expect it. In such a world, the commander's map was never only a drawing of space, it was a record of risk. Signs mattered as well. Dust rising in certain ways might suggest movement. Birds lifting from a place might show hidden men. Campfires, silence, noise, the arrangement of enemy troops, and the behavior of envoys could all become pieces of a larger reading. Sun Tzu's text often asks the commander to notice what lies at the edge of ordinary attention. The army that knows how to look can sometimes discover the enemy's condition before the enemy openly declares it. There is a quiet discipline in this kind of seeing. It does not depend on mystical insight. It depends on repeated observation, comparison, memory, and the refusal to let desire decide what evidence means. A commander who wants the enemy to be weak may mistake disorder for collapse. A ruler who wants a quick triumph may treat warning signs as hesitation from timid advisors. The strategic mind must keep itself from becoming servant to appetite. Reports therefore needed judgment. An informant might lie, misunderstand, exaggerate, or speak from private hatred. A spy might be doubled. A local guide might know one valley well and another not at all. News from one border could be old by the time it reached court. The value of intelligence depended not only on gathering it, but on weighing it. In this sense, information was like grain, necessary, movable, and capable of spoiling when handled badly. Sun Tzu's world also understood that the enemy was thinking in the same way. Deception worked because both sides were trying to read each other. A false appearance had value only where someone else was watching. To seem near when distant, distant when near, strong when weak, or hesitant when prepared was to enter the enemy's mind before entering his territory. The struggle over perception began before armies touched the same ground. This is why spies and signs lead naturally back to the idea of economy. Knowledge saves motion. A well-informed commander does not need to test every road with blood or every enemy formation with assault. He can avoid what is strong, press what is uncertain, separate what is joined, and wait where haste would serve the enemy. The value of information lies partly in the actions it prevents. In Sun Tzu's severe arithmetic, an avoided mistake is a kind of victory. The political side of intelligence was just as important as the military side. Courts had factions. Ministers had rivals. Generals had jealousies. Alliances had public language and private doubt. An enemy state might look unified from the outside while being divided within, or appear weak while still possessing loyalty enough to endure. The commander who knew only the army missed the court behind it. The advisor who knew only the court missed the roads by which policy became movement. Wu's struggle with Chu required both kinds of knowledge. Chu's size made it formidable, but size could also create slowness, confidence, and difficulty in coordinating distant forces. Wu Zishu's experience inside Chu's world gave Wu a special kind of insight, one no map alone could provide. He understood not only territory but memory, not only roots but resentments, not only the existence of Chu's court but something of its habits. In the company of Sun Wu's strategic tradition, such knowledge could become part of a larger design. A commander reading terrain and a minister reading a court were doing related work. Both were studying conditions before action. Both were trying to find the place where effort would matter most. The enemy's weak road, the enemy's divided council, the enemy's exposed supply line, and the enemy's overconfident ruler all belonged to the same field of judgment. Victory before battle was not magic. It was the patient reduction of uncertainty. Still, knowledge never removed danger completely. Ancient intelligence was partial, delayed, and often stained by motive. No commander could know everything. Sun Tzu's answer was not to wait for perfect certainty, because perfect certainty does not belong to war. His answer was to gather more, judge better, move with discipline, and avoid acting merely because fear or pride demanded motion. To know more than the enemy was not to know all things. It was to stand one step less blind. This hidden labor of knowledge prepares the way for Wu's great movement against Chu. The coming campaign would not be decided only by courage in the field, nor only by He Liu's ambition, nor only by Wu Zishu's bitterness toward the state that had destroyed his family. It would depend on roots, timing, morale, counsel, terrain, and the ability of a rising state to strike a larger one where size did not protect it. The art of war now moves from principle into one of the great remembered conflicts of the age, Wu against Chu. Chapter 7. Wu against Chu. Wu's rise became impossible to ignore when it turned toward Chu. For years, Chu had stood as one of the great powers of the southern world, large in territory, old in royal confidence, and strong enough that rival courts had to measure their own plans against it. A smaller or newer state might harass such a power at the edges, but to strike deeply into Chu required something more serious than resentment. It required preparation, timing, and the belief that a state with less inherited weight could still find an opening in a larger enemy. King He Liu's Wu had been moving toward that moment through several forms of strength. He Liu supplied ambition and royal authority. Wu Zishu supplied memory of Chu's court, sharpened by exile and loss. Sun Wu, in the tradition, supplied a method of command that made courage answerable to discipline. None of these elements alone would have been enough. Together they made Wu dangerous because they joined motive, knowledge, and organization in a state eager to test itself against a power that had long seemed beyond its reach. Chu's size was both protection and burden. A large state could gather men, claim prestige, and absorb pressure across wide territory, but scale could also slow response and encourage confidence. Orders had farther to travel. Local commanders had to be trusted. Court factions could distort judgment before news from the frontier became action. A state accustomed to being feared might misread the intention of a smaller rival. In that gap between confidence and readiness, Wu found the possibility of movement. The campaign remembered most clearly is the one that led to the Battle of Boju in 506 BCE. It stands in the tradition as Wu's great challenge to Chu, and it belongs to the same strategic world that makes Sun Tzu intelligible. The event was not merely a clash between two armies. It was the result of years of rivalry, counsel, grievance, and military preparation. A battle may receive the name, but the forces that made it possible had been accumulating long before the armies met. Wu Zishu's presence gave the campaign a personal edge. His father and brother had been killed under Chu authority, and the story of his flight from Chu gave later memory a figure whose private injury became entangled with public war. Revenge, however, cannot explain the whole movement. A king does not send a state into a major campaign only to satisfy the grief of one advisor, however useful that advisor may be. Wu Zishu mattered because his bitterness came joined to knowledge. He knew the enemy not as a distant abstraction, but as a court with habits, weaknesses, and men whose decisions could be anticipated. Sun Wu's traditional role in the campaign is harder to see with modern certainty. Later accounts connect him to Heliu's military success, and the logic of the tradition places him near the planning and command of Wu's army. Yet the historian has to keep one hand on the record and one hand on the memory that record preserves. It is safest to say that the campaigns of Wu became the historical field onto which Sun Tzu's reputation was drawn. Whether every order came from Sun Wu's mouth is less important than the way his name became attached to a style of warfare based on discipline and calculation. The movement against Chu required attention to terrain. Wu could not simply push forward as if space were empty. Rivers, roads, crossings, and supply routes shaped the campaign's possibilities. The lower Yangtze world and the approaches toward Chu made geography part of command. An army moving through such a landscape had to remain organized while passing through country that might divide units, slow carts, or expose men to attack at crossings. Disorder on the road could ruin a plan before the enemy offered a decisive fight. Wu's advantage lay partly in refusing to meet Chu only where Chu expected strength to be measured. The smaller state had to move with care and speed, choosing routes and timing in ways that unsettled the larger one. Here the principles associated with Sun Tzu feel close to the historical event. To attack where the enemy is unready, to move where he does not expect, to preserve force while forcing the opponent into confusion. These are not decorations added to war after the fact. They are the methods by which a rising state could make size less decisive. The Battle of Boju itself should be treated as a turning point rather than a scene of noise. Wu defeated Chu's forces and opened the way toward Ying, Chu's capital. That outcome carried enormous meaning. To lose an army was one thing. To see an enemy approach the royal and ritual center of the state was another. Capitals are not only administrative places. They hold ancestral memory, court hierarchy, archives, treasures, and the visible dignity of rule. When an enemy reaches such a place, the wound touches the state's image of itself. Ying had long been one of the centers of Chu power. Its occupation by Wu marked a humiliation remembered beyond the immediate campaign. The entry into the capital did not mean Chu disappeared. Great states could bend without ceasing to exist. But the fact that Wu could reach Ying showed that Chu was vulnerable in a way its size had concealed. For rival courts watching from elsewhere, the lesson would have been plain enough. A state once assumed to be secure had been forced to experience the consequences of misjudging a smaller enemy. Wu Zishu's personal story darkened the memory of this moment. Later tradition says that after Wu entered Ying, he took revenge upon the dead King Ping of Chu, whose decisions had destroyed his family. The details vary in moral weight and later interpretation, and they do not need to be lingered over. What matters is that Chinese historical memory preserved the episode as a sign of how private grievance could outlive exile, cross state borders, and return in the company of an army. For Helu, the campaign brought glory. But glory could not settle everything. Victory over Chu raised Wu's standing, yet it also placed the state inside a more dangerous political field. A power that proves it can reach a great capital earns fear, and fear invites counter-calculation. Other states must ask whether Wu is a useful ally, a rising threat, or a temporary disturbance that may later be contained. The campaign also revealed the limits of a single victory. Chu suffered, but it endured. Its territory, population, traditions, and political identity did not vanish because Ying had been entered. Ancient states could recover from humiliation if their structures remained strong enough, and the memory of defeat could itself become a force in later policy. Wu had shown brilliance, but it had not solved the problem of living among rivals. A campaign could break an enemy's confidence for a time without ending the rivalry that produced the campaign. This distinction belongs near the center of Sun Tzu's world. Tactical success, operational success, and strategic success are not always the same. An army can win a battle and still leave its ruler with a harder future. A king can gain fame and also create new fears. A state can weaken one enemy while neglecting another. The brilliance of Wu's movement against Chu becomes clearer when placed beside the later fate of Wu itself, because history did not stop at the moment of victory. Yu remained near, while Wu looked toward Chu and measured itself against a great southern power. Another rival watched from closer ground. Yu's place in the story will grow later, but even here its shadow matters. The state that wins a great campaign may become most vulnerable when it begins to believe the campaign has revealed the whole field. Sun Tzu's text warns repeatedly against misreading conditions. The enemy before the army is not always the only danger the state must consider. The Battle of Boju therefore stands as both achievement and warning. Wu had organized itself well enough to defeat a larger power and reach the heart of Chu. He Liu's ambition, Wu Zishu's counsel, and the strategic tradition attached to Sun Wu all seemed to meet in that success. Yet the very scale of the victory widened Wu's obligations. It had to hold prestige, manage fear, guard against Yu, and keep its own court from confusing triumph with permanence. Victory had opened a larger room, and every door in that room led toward another danger. In later memory, Sun Tzu's name remained close to Wu's success because the campaign appeared to demonstrate the principles his book would teach: preparation before movement, knowledge before contact, discipline before force, and the careful use of advantage against a stronger opponent. Whether the man himself stood at every decisive point cannot be proven in the way modern biography would prefer. But the world that remembered him saw in Wu's achievement the kind of war his name explained. Wu against Chu was the moment when a rising state showed what disciplined ambition could do. It humbled a great power, carried an army into a royal center, and made the southern balance of power look different from before. Yet beyond the triumph waited the less visible problem of governing success. The same court that had listened to hard counsel and moved with calculation would soon have to manage succession, pride, faction, and the uncomfortable voices of advisors who saw danger after victory. From the field of Boju, the story turns back toward the court, where ministers, generals, and kings could become more dangerous to one another than an enemy beyond the border. Chapter 8. The Minister, the General, and the Fragile State. Victory brought Wu into a more dangerous kind of prominence. After the campaign against Chu and the entry into Ying, King He Liu's state could no longer be treated as a restless power on the edge of the older Chinese world. Wu had shown that it could wound a great state, move with discipline, and carry ambition farther than its rivals may have expected. Yet the success that made Wu impressive also made its future more difficult. A state that rises quickly must learn how to live with the fear it creates. He Liu's reign belonged to the great ascending moment of Wu. In later memory, he stands near Sun Wu, Wu Zishu, and the campaigns that gave the state its sharpest reputation. His kingship gave military talent a place to act. He listened to hard men, accepted severe counsel, and allowed his state to become more organized than its older rivals might have wished. Still, a ruler's reign is only one part of a state's life. After success comes inheritance, and inheritance often tests a political order more quietly than war. The problem of succession brought King Fuchai into the center of the story. Fuchai inherited not only a throne, but the weight of what Helu had made possible. He received a Wu that had learned to imagine itself as a great power, a court that had tasted victory, and advisors whose reputations had been formed in the older king's service. To inherit such a state was not merely to possess strength. It was to inherit expectations, rivalries, warnings, unfinished wars, and the temptation to believe that earlier success had become a permanent condition. Wu Zishu remained one of the most important figures around the court. His life had been shaped by the destruction of his family in Chu, by exile, by service to Wu, and by his role in the campaign that humbled the state he hated. A man like that could be invaluable to a ruler, but he could also become difficult after the great purpose of his life had partly been fulfilled. His counsel was rooted in memory and danger. He had seen how courts could destroy loyal servants, and he knew how quickly royal favor could turn into suspicion. Fuchai's attention moved increasingly toward Yue. The conflict between Wu and Yu had begun before his full prominence, and it would become the central struggle of his reign. Yu was smaller than Chu, closer than Chu, and in some ways more dangerous because of that closeness. A great distant enemy could command awe. A nearby rival could wait, watch, submit when necessary, and return when attention wandered. Wu Zishu understood this danger with a clarity that later tradition treated as tragic. Gozhen of Yue enters the story here as a defeated ruler who did not disappear. After conflict with Wu, Yu was forced into submission, and Gozhen's humiliation became one of the most memorable examples of patience after defeat in Chinese historical tradition. Fuchai had the opportunity to destroy Yue completely, or at least to break it more thoroughly, but he did not take the advice that urged such finality. Wu Zishu warned against leaving Yue alive as a future threat. The warning was not dramatic prophecy. It was political memory applied to a living enemy. Counsel in an ancient court carried danger because it stood so close to pride. A minister could tell a ruler what served the state, but the ruler might hear only what wounded his authority. This was especially true after victory. Success makes unwelcome advice harder to receive. A king who has defeated enemies may begin to suspect that caution is weakness, that warnings are resentment, and that old ministers are trying to govern through fear. The advisor who once sounded necessary can begin to sound obstructive. Bo Pi, another figure at the court of Wu, complicates the story. Tradition remembers him as an official whose influence worked against Wu Zishu and helped turn Fuchai away from the harder counsel. Court politics rarely unfolds as a simple contest between wisdom and foolishness. It often takes shape through access, tone, personal trust, resentment, and the quiet art of making one voice easier to hear than another. A ruler surrounded by advisors does not hear advice in equal measure. He hears what reaches him through favor. Wu Zishu's position therefore became more fragile. His service had been immense, but immense service can become a burden to the ruler who benefits from it. The old minister carried too much memory. He remembered Helu's rise, Chu's humiliation, the cost of past decisions, and the danger of leaving enemies half-contained. Fuchai, ruling in his own right, may have found such memory intolerable. The man who had helped build Wu's greatness now stood as a reminder that the king's freedom was bounded by consequences. Formal remonstrance was one of the most difficult duties of a minister. To remonstrate was to correct, warn, or oppose a ruler while still acknowledging the ruler's authority. The act required a delicate kind of courage. It could be praised in moral texts and punished in actual courts. A minister who never warned his ruler failed in service, but a minister who warned too strongly could be accused of arrogance, disloyalty, or bitterness. The line between loyal severity and political danger was never secure. Wu Zishu crossed that dangerous line because his warnings did not soften. He urged Fu Chai to recognize the threat of Yue and not be distracted by other ambitions. He understood that a defeated enemy who retains leadership, memory, and time may become stronger through humiliation. A state spared after defeat does not always become grateful. Sometimes it becomes patient. Gojian's Yu would prove that patience could become a weapon more enduring than immediate force. The fate of Wu Zishu is one of the darker turns in the story. Fu Chai eventually ordered him to die, according to the traditional accounts, and the old minister's warnings were removed from the living court. The physical details are not needed here. What matters is the political shape of the event. A ruler silenced the man who had seen danger clearly, and by doing so, he weakened the state's ability to correct itself. Counsel had become unbearable before it had become false. Sun Wu himself recedes from the record around this part of the tradition. That absence is important. The story of Wu continues, but the man attached to the art of war becomes less visible as later events unfold. Perhaps he had died. Perhaps he had withdrawn. Perhaps the tradition simply did not preserve his later years. Ancient memory can keep one scene bright and leave the rest in shadow. This fading should not be treated as failure of the story. It shows how the biography of Sun Tzu is tied to the fortunes of Wu without being able to follow every turn of Wu's politics. The text attributed to him speaks repeatedly about rulers, generals, calculation, danger, and the cost of misjudgment. Wu's later history becomes a living commentary on those concerns. Whether Sun Wu personally watched Fu Chai disregard Wu Zishu or not, the state's fate reveals the strategic world his name came to represent. Fu Chai's ambitions moved beyond the immediate problem of Yue. He sought recognition among the great powers and became involved in the politics of hegemony, where rulers competed for status as much as safety. Prestige could be useful, but it could also distract. A ruler looking northward toward wider recognition might fail to attend closely enough to the enemy recovering nearby. In the arithmetic of strategy, distance and danger are not always proportional. The closest threat may be the one a proud ruler least wants to fear. Yu waited under Gojian. The old stories would later remember his endurance in almost moral terms, as if defeat had stripped him down to patience and purpose. Fan Li and Wen Zhong, advisors of Yu, helped shape the slow recovery that Wu failed to prevent. The contrast with Wu Zishu is sharp. Wu dismissed the counselor who warned it. Yu listened to the counselors who taught it to wait. In that difference, the later reversal begins to take form. A state can survive defeat if it remains capable of learning. A state can be damaged by victory if victory persuades it that learning is no longer necessary. Wu had organized itself, humbled Chu, and risen into fame. Then its court began to lose the habit of listening to the kind of warning that had once made its rise possible. Sun Tzu's principles are often remembered as advice for defeating enemies, but they also speak to the danger inside command itself. The enemy outside the border is not the only force that can ruin a campaign or a kingdom. The fragile state, then, was not weak in the ordinary sense. Wu had armies, prestige, memory of victory, and a ruler eager for recognition. Its fragility lay in judgment. It lay in the court's ability or inability to hear unwelcome truth, to distinguish flattery from counsel, and to remember that an enemy spared for convenience may return with discipline sharpened by humiliation. From the court of Fu Chai and the fate of Wu Zikyu, the story moves toward Yu, where defeat did not end ambition, and revenge learned to wait. Chapter 9. Yue, Revenge, and the Limits of Strategy. Yu did not disappear when it was defeated. That simple fact became one of the great warnings in the story of Wu. Fu Chai had brought Yu low, and Gojian, its ruler, had been forced into humiliation and submission. yet the state remained alive enough to remember itself. In the hard politics of the age, an enemy left standing could become more dangerous after defeat than before it, because defeat sometimes burned away distraction and left only patience. Gojan's story belongs to the deep reservoir of Chinese historical memory. Later generations remembered him as the ruler who endured disgrace, accepted hardship, and prepared for revenge over many years. The phrase often associated with him, sleeping on brushwood and tasting gore, belongs to that moralized tradition of endurance, whether every detail is accepted as literal or not. What mattered to later readers was the shape of the memory. A king who refused to let humiliation become final. His defeat became discipline. Wu Zixu had understood the danger. His advice to Fuchai was severe because the situation was severe. Yu was close, wounded, and still ruled by a man capable of waiting. A more distant enemy might need long preparation to threaten Wu, but Yu's nearness meant that recovery could become dangerous before Wu fully noticed it. The old minister saw that mercy, vanity, distraction, or political convenience could leave a future enemy intact. His warning was not the fear of an aging man. It was the logic of strategy turned toward tomorrow. Fuchai chose another course. He accepted Yue's submission and allowed Gojan to live under conditions that marked him as defeated but did not erase his capacity to rule again. Submission in ancient interstate politics could take many forms: tribute, service, ritual deference, hostages, humiliating attendance, and the visible acknowledgement of another ruler's superiority. Such arrangements could preserve order for a time. They could also preserve resentment in a form that learned to speak politely until it was strong enough to act. Gojan's endurance became part of Yu's recovery. He did not return at once to open defiance. He submitted, waited, listened, and gathered strength inside the narrow space defeat had left him. The discipline required for such patience is easy to admire from a distance and difficult to live inside. A humiliated ruler had to control not only his enemies, but his own appetite for immediate restoration. If he moved too soon, Yu might be destroyed. If he waited too long, his people might settle into defeat. Fan Li and Wen Zhong enter the story as the advisors who helped shape Yue's return. They understood that revenge could not be only emotion. It had to become policy. Yue had to rebuild resources, strengthen government, manage appearances, and let Wu grow less cautious. A defeated state preparing revenge could not afford the luxury of looking dangerous too early. It needed to become useful, obedient, or forgettable in the eyes of the power that had spared it. There is a strategic severity in that kind of patience. Yue's recovery depended on time, and time had to be protected by conduct. Gojan could not behave like a triumphant ruler before he had regained the conditions of rule. His court had to accept discipline, concealment, and long preparation. In this sense, Yu's story mirrors Sun Tzu's principles from the opposite side of victory. The defeated state survived by controlling appearance, preserving strength, and waiting for the enemy's judgment to decay. Wu, meanwhile, had begun to look beyond Yu. Fuchai sought recognition among the larger interstate powers, and the desire for prestige pulled his attention toward grander stages. This was understandable. A ruler who had inherited Wu's victories did not want to remain merely the king of a regional power. He wanted status among the great courts, acknowledgement of Wu's place in the hierarchy of states, and the dignity that came from being feared and courted beyond his own borders. Prestige, however, can become a form of distance from danger. Yue's danger grew in that distance. As Fuchai looked outward, Gojan looked steadily back toward Wu. The contrast is one of the most instructive in the whole story. Wu had achieved greatness and became vulnerable to the distractions of greatness. Yue had been reduced and became sharper through reduction. Neither state stood still, but they moved inwardly in opposite directions. Wu widened its gaze. Yue narrowed its purpose. Sun Tzu's text often returns to the idea that conditions determine action. One does not move because desire says move. One moves because the ground, the enemy, the timing, the state of one's own forces, and the balance of advantage permit movement. You had to wait until those conditions changed. Fu Chai's confidence, the removal of Wu Zishu, the court's susceptibility to easier counsel, and the burdens of wider ambition all helped change them. A state's weakness is not always visible in its army. Sometimes it appears first in what its ruler refuses to consider. The removal of Wu Zishu was therefore not an isolated tragedy. It was a strategic event. When Fu Chai silenced the minister who understood Yue's danger, Wu lost more than a man. It lost a form of memory inside the court. Wu Zishu remembered what enemies could become, because he himself had been an exile turned into an instrument against Chu. He knew that injury could travel through years. By rejecting him, Fu Chai rejected a warning written in the life of his own advisor. Yue's eventual revenge unfolded as the return of everything Wu had tried not to see. Guzhen rebuilt his state, prepared his people, and waited until Wu's strength was stretched by ambition and weakened by misjudgment. The later fall of Wu did not come as a sudden moral lesson dropped onto the story. It came through the long working of choices, an enemy spared, a warning dismissed, a court divided, a ruler drawn toward prestige, and a patient rival allowed to recover. Strategy is often less dramatic than fate, but it can be just as unforgiving. Fan Li's later withdrawal from political life gives the story a quieter afternote. Tradition remembers him as a man who helped Yue succeed and then left before success became dangerous to him. Whether every layer of his later legend is accepted or not, the pattern itself mattered to later Chinese readers. The advisor who knows when to serve must also know when to depart. Courts reward usefulness until they begin to fear it. Wu Zishu had learned that truth too late, or perhaps had been too loyal to act upon it. Wen Zhong's fate, in contrast, was remembered more darkly. After Yu's victory, he did not escape the danger that success brought to ministers who had helped create it. The comparison between Fan Li and Wen Zhong became another lesson in the peril of service. Advisors could help rulers rise, but once the ruler no longer needed the same kind of counsel, the advisor's own importance might become uncomfortable. Ancient courts could consume the men who had saved them. These stories around Yu show the limits of strategy in a way that pure doctrine cannot. Sun Tzu teaches calculation, but calculation depends on the willingness to listen. He teaches knowledge, but knowledge must be admitted into decision. He teaches the danger of prolonged conflict and the value of breaking the enemy's will, but a ruler must still judge when an enemy has truly been broken. Fu Chai's failure lay not in lacking power, but in misreading the living condition of Yue after defeat. Victory can deceive the victor. It can make present strength appear permanent, make spared enemies seem harmless, and make old advisors sound like remnants of a more anxious age. Defeat can also instruct the defeated. It can concentrate attention, expose weakness, and teach a court to value preparation over display. Wu and Yue changed under the influence of their own fortunes. One loosened after success, the other tightened after humiliation. The fall of Wu does not erase its earlier brilliance. He Liu's state had risen with remarkable force. It had challenged Chu, entered Ying, and given Sun Tzu's remembered principles a historical field in which they could seem alive. But the later reversal prevents the story from becoming a simple celebration of victory. A state that wins one great war may still lose the longer contest if it forgets that every victory changes the conditions around it. Yue's revenge brings the biography of Sun Wu almost to the edge of silence. His name remains attached to the art of strategy, But the events after Wu's rise are carried by Fuchai, Wu Zishu, Gojian, Fan Li, and Wen Zhong. That silence is fitting. The man becomes less visible just as the lessons attached to his name become more visible. The world continues to demonstrate the principles even when the traditional author has stepped back into uncertainty. The story now turns from the fortunes of Wu and Yue to the thing that survived them both. States rose, councils were ignored, capitals were entered, ministers died, and patient enemies returned. Yet a short work in 13 chapters continued to move through history after the political world that had formed it was gone. To understand why Sun Tzu became more than a name from a broken age, the next step is to follow the book itself. Bamboo, ink, buried slips, copied chapters, and the long material life of the art of war. Chapter 10. 13 chapters in bamboo and ink. The states that gave Sun Tzu his first historical world did not survive in the form that had made them powerful. Wu rose, humbled Chu, misjudged Yu, and passed into memory. Yu had its own season of strength and then, like the others, entered the long movement by which the old interstate order gave way to larger formations of power. Yet the text attached to Sun Tzu did something the states themselves could not do. It continued. A book in ancient China did not survive by magic or by mere reputation. It survived because hands copied it, readers valued it, rulers preserved it, scholars arranged it, and later generations decided that its words still deserved space among the works of the past. Before paper became common, texts were often written on bamboo slips or wooden strips, then bound together with cords. A chapter was not a stack of modern pages. It was a sequence of narrow written objects, physically vulnerable to rot, fire, breakage, disorder, and loss. Bamboo gives the old military text a material weight that modern quotation often removes. Each slip could hold a vertical line or a portion of a passage. A whole work required many such slips, prepared, written, and tied in order. If the cords broke, the sequence could be disturbed. If a tomb preserved a text, it preserved not an abstract idea floating outside time, but ink on material that had once been handled, stored, buried, and forgotten. The survival of thought depended on the endurance of things. The Art of War came down in 13 chapters. That number became part of the book's identity, giving shape to a text that is brief when compared with its reputation. Its chapters speak of planning, waging war, attack by stratagem, tactical disposition, energy, weakness and strength, maneuver, variation, movement, terrain, the 9 grounds, attack by fire, and the use of spies. The arrangement gives the work a disciplined compactness. It does not try to describe every possible battle. It tries to form judgment before battle becomes necessary. The received text, however, is not the same as a modern manuscript signed and dated by an author whose life is independently documented. It passed through transmission. That means copying, selection, correction, commentary, loss, recovery, and the slow authority of use. Each stage could preserve and alter at the same time. A scribe might correct a character, misread a damaged mark, arrange slips, or follow an edition already shaped by earlier hands. Textual survival is a form of continuity, but it is never pure stillness. This matters for Sun Tzu because the man and the book are not equally visible. Sun Wu, the remembered general, appears through tradition. The book appears through a material and textual history that can sometimes be examined more directly. A biography may become uncertain where a manuscript remains concrete. An excavated slip does not tell us everything about authorship, but it can tell us that a text, or a form of a text, was circulating by a certain period. That kind of evidence has a different calm authority. One of the most important modern moments in the history of the art of war came in 1972, when archaeologists excavated Han Dynasty tombs at Yunquishan in Shandong province. Among the finds were bamboo slips containing texts associated with Sun Tzu and Sun Bin. The discovery mattered because it brought buried material evidence into a discussion that had long depended on received editions and later tradition. Old questions did not vanish, but they could now be asked beside objects that had rested for centuries underground. Yinghuishan gave scholars something unusually valuable: early versions of military texts linked to the Sun name. The slips showed that the art of war was not merely a late invention projected backward without ancient substance. They helped confirm that a form of the Sun Tzu text was already known in the Han period, and they also clarified the separate existence of material associated with Sun Bin, another military thinker whose identity had sometimes complicated the tradition. Bamboo, in this case, did not solve every mystery. It narrowed the room in which guesswork could move. Sun Bin deserves careful placement here. He is not Sun Wu, though the names have sometimes been entangled in later discussion. Sun Bin belonged to a later world, usually associated with the Warring States period, and his own military text had been lost for a long time before the Yinghuishan discovery brought it back into view. The recovery of his work helped scholars distinguish between two strategic traditions that had both carried the Sun name. Instead of one shadowy figure absorbing every military idea attached to that name, the record became more layered and more precise. The rediscovery also reminds us that ancient Chinese thought did not survive only through famous printed classics. It survived in tombs, fragments, catalogues, commentaries, quotations, and damaged copies. Sometimes a text remained known through continuous transmission. Sometimes it disappeared from ordinary reading and returned because the earth had protected what libraries had lost. A buried manuscript can change the way the living understand a book they thought they already knew. For the art of war, the 13-chapter structure gave later readers a stable frame, but the words inside that frame carried signs of transmission. Variants between excavated material and received versions allowed scholars to see how copying and editing may have worked across time. A difference in wording can reveal more than error. It can show how readers understood a passage, how a line was clarified, how an old term became difficult, or how a military concept was adjusted within a changing language of war. The Han world that preserved these texts was already imperial. The old states of Wu, Shu, Yue, Qi, Qin, and others had been absorbed into a larger historical memory. Under empire, military writings could be collected, classified, and read as part of state knowledge rather than as the property of one desperate court. A text born from interstate danger could become a classic within an imperial archive. Its original urgency changed form, but it did not lose all force. That change in setting is important. In the spring and autumn or warring states world, a military text could serve rulers fighting for survival among rivals. In the Han, it could serve a court that looked backward over the violent centuries before unification and tried to gather their lessons into order. The book's survival therefore depended on a new political world preserving the knowledge of an older, fractured one. The physical form of the text also shaped how it was read. Bamboo slips do not encourage careless skimming. They belong to a slower world of copying, handling, arrangement, and memorization. A reader encountered the work through effort and attention, often within an elite culture where texts were studied as instruments of conduct and government. The military classic was not only a set of battlefield tips, it was part of a broader education in rule, judgment, and the consequences of miscalculation. Sun Tzu's later reputation can make the book seem timeless in the shallow sense, as if it floated above the circumstances of its making. The bamboo slips resist that flattening. They remind us that the text had a body. It belonged to materials, tombs, scribes, catalogers, and readers who lived in specific dynasties. Its survival required conditions as real as the grain and roads that Sun Tzu himself treated as part of war. Even a theory of strategy needed supply lines through time. Yingquishan did not give back the private life of Sun Wu. It did not tell us where he was born with certainty, how he spoke in Helu's court, or how long he lived after the campaigns associated with Wu. What it gave back was another form of closeness. It placed early military writing under the eye again. It showed the Sun Tzu tradition not as a late mist without substance, but as a textual presence already embedded in the ancient world of manuscript transmission. The 13 chapters continued because they were useful. Rulers, generals, scholars, and later commentators found in them a language for thinking about conflict without being dazzled by the appearance of conflict. The book's compactness helped it travel. A shorter work can be copied, memorized, glossed, carried, quoted, and taught with unusual force. Its severity invited explanation, and explanation invited commentary. Once commentary began to gather around it, the text acquired another kind of life. By following the book into bamboo and ink, the story moves away from the visible drama of Wu and Yu without leaving Sun Tzu behind. The man remains uncertain, but the work becomes more material. It can be buried, recovered, compared, copied, and argued over. Its survival shows that strategy did not belong only to one ruler or one campaign. It belonged to the longer transformation of Chinese warfare and statecraft, a transformation that would become even clearer in the harsher and more systematic world of the warring states. Chapter 11. The Warring States' Mind. The world that carried the art of war forward became harder, larger, and more systematic than the one traditionally associated with Sun Wu. The Spring and Autumn Age had already weakened the old Zhou order, but the Warring States period pushed that weakening into a more relentless form. Rival states no longer fought only for precedence, revenge, border adjustment, or the dignity of noble houses. They fought to survive, absorb, reform, and dominate in a political landscape where failure could mean disappearance. This later world matters because the book attached to Sun Tzu speaks with a mind suited to large danger. It does not treat war as a ritual encounter between aristocrats. It treats it as a contest of state capacity, intelligence, deception, terrain, discipline, and political judgment. Those concerns belong naturally to an age in which rulers could not depend on inherited prestige to protect them. The state that organized better, counted better, recruited better, and listened better could overcome rivals with older names and softer habits. The warring states were not merely violent in a simple sense. They were inventive under pressure. Governments became more interested in registration, taxation, law, agriculture, military reward, and the direct control of populations. Rulers drew advisors from outside old hereditary circles because the needs of survival had become too urgent to leave every office to lineage. Men who could strengthen the state became valuable even when their origins, tone, or teachings disturbed the old aristocratic comfort. Sun Tzu's text fits that atmosphere because it assumes that war belongs to the whole state. A campaign is not only the general's affair. It rests on the ruler's judgment, the discipline of officers, the condition of the people, the reliability of supply, the reading of terrain, the use of spies, and the timing of movement. A military defeat may begin in court, just as a battlefield victory may begin in a storehouse or in the quiet turning of an enemy agent. The warring state's mind learned to see power as a system. Sun Bin appears here as a necessary companion and complication. He was not Sun Wu, though later confusion around the Sun name sometimes blurred the distinction. Tradition places Sun Bin in the Warring States period, connected especially with the state of Qi and the contests of that later age. His own military text, recovered in the Yingquishan bamboo slips, confirmed that the world of Chinese strategic writing was richer than a single famous book. The Sun name did not belong to one flat shadow. It stood near more than one current of military thought. Sun Bin's remembered life carried its own marks of danger. Later tradition says he suffered mutilation through political betrayal, then found his way into service where his strategic intelligence became decisive. The details belong to the moral and political storytelling of early Chinese history, but the larger pattern is familiar: a wounded advisor, a court willing to use talent, a rival state vulnerable to misdirection, and a strategist whose strength lay in reading the enemy's assumptions. The story belongs to the same world in which knowledge could become revenge, service, and survival at once. One famous account associated with Sun Bin concerns the conflict between Qi and Wei, where indirect movement and manipulation of expectation allowed Qi to strike with advantage. The remembered strategy of relieving Zhao by attacking Wei became one of the clearest illustrations of winning by altering the enemy's position rather than meeting his strength directly. Whether told as military history or as strategic teaching, the episode shows how later Chinese memory valued the mind that could change the shape of a conflict before the main force was fully spent. A road taken away from the expected battlefield could become the true battlefield. Wu Qi also belongs to this harder world. He served as a military and political reformer, and his name became associated with another major military classic. Like many capable men in this age, he moved through danger as much as opportunity. Service to rulers could bring power, but reform created enemies, and a minister who strengthened a state often weakened the privileges of men already comfortable within it. The warring states rewarded talent and punished it with almost the same hand. The reforms associated with men like Wu Qi and, later, Shang Yang in Qin show how war and administration began to tighten around each other. Fields, households, ranks, punishments, rewards, and military service were increasingly drawn into systems of state control. A ruler who wanted stronger armies could not think only about generals. He had to think about farmers, records, laws, and the incentives that tied ordinary labor to military capacity. In such a world, strategy became inseparable from government. That is why the military texts of the period do not stand apart from philosophy and statecraft. They belong near thinkers who asked how rulers should command, how law should operate, how names and realities should match, how rewards and punishments should shape conduct, and how disorder might be made obedient to institutions. Sun Tzu, Han Fei, and other later thinkers were not writing military manuals in the same sense as Sun Tzu, but they inhabited a world where order had to be constructed rather than assumed. Their concerns shared the same air. Junzi looked toward ritual, education, and the shaping of human conduct, but with a sober understanding that people required formation. Han Fei, writing in the legalist tradition, placed heavier trust in law, technique, and the ruler's control of ministers. Their differences were significant, yet both reveal a world no longer satisfied by inherited virtue alone. The ruler needed methods. The state needed instruments. Power had to be made reliable through systems that did not depend on the goodness of every person inside them. The art of war speaks from within that broad transformation, even where its exact date and layers remain debated. It assumes that men can be ordered, deceived, measured, encouraged, exhausted, divided, and directed. It assumes that a commander must understand both material conditions and human response. This combination gives the text its unusual reach. It does not reduce war to numbers, but it never lets courage float free from conditions. It does not ignore morale, but it roots morale in situation, leadership, and the structure of advantage. Crossbows, larger infantry forces, fortified cities, and longer campaigns made warfare more demanding than the older image of noble chariots moving across a field. Defensive works could slow conquest. Massed soldiers required firmer command. Supply became heavier. The punishment for miscalculation grew larger because the resources committed to war had increased. A ruler who ordered a campaign badly could endanger not only a border but the entire balance of his state's power. Professional advisors became one answer to this danger. They traveled, persuaded, served, and sometimes betrayed. Their value lay in knowledge that was not purely hereditary. A man with the right plan could become more useful than a noble with the right ancestry. This did not make the age open or fair in a modern sense. Courts remained dangerous, rank mattered, and rulers could discard servants suddenly. But the pressure of competition widened the path through which ability could enter power. The warring state's mind therefore treated strategy as a form of disciplined perception. To see clearly was already to gain ground. The ruler had to see the condition of his own state without flattery. The general had to see the enemy without fear or wishfulness. The advisor had to see the court itself, because a good plan might fail if envy, pride, or faction turned the ruler away from it. A map of the battlefield was incomplete without a map of the human arrangements behind it. This is the world in which the uncertainty around Sun Tzu becomes less troubling. Whether the received text came wholly from Sun Wu of Wu, or whether it passed through later hands shaped by warring states' conditions, it belongs unmistakably to a tradition of thought formed by interstate danger. Its authority does not depend only on a single scene before King Helu. It depends on the fact that generation after generation found its principles fitted to the problems that real states faced. The book survived because its ideas could be used. At the same time, the distinction between Sun Wu and Sun Bin protects the story from becoming too simple. Ancient Chinese military thought was not one book, one master, one doctrine, and one line of influence. It was a field of texts and remembered figures, some lost, some recovered, some edited, some argued over by later commentators. The existence of Sun Bin's text shows that the Sun Tzu tradition lived among neighbors. It was part of a crowded intellectual landscape, not a lonely monument. The warring states eventually ended in unification under Qin, but before that ending, they produced the conditions in which strategic thought became urgent, technical, and portable. A ruler in Qin, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, or Wei needed more than old legitimacy. He needed grain, law, soldiers, advisors, roads, punishments, rewards, and the capacity to act faster or more intelligently than his rivals. In that demanding world, a compact book on war could become more than advice for generals. It could become a grammar of survival. The story now moves from that world of competing states into the hands of those who preserved it. The men of the warring states used strategy to live through danger, but later historians and scholars had to decide how danger would be remembered. Sun Wu's name, Sun Bin's recovered distinction, the lessons of Wu and Yu, and the 13 chapters all passed into a new setting under empire. There, in Han historical writing and archival memory, Sun Tzu became not only a strategic voice from the past, but a figure arranged within the long record of Chinese civilization. Chapter 12. The Han Historians and the Making of Sun Tzu. Sima Qian wrote long after the age in which Sun Wu was said to have lived. Between the remembered general of Wu and the historian of the Han stood centuries of war, reform, conquest, unification, collapse, and imperial rebuilding. The old world of rival states had become history by the time Sima Qian placed Sun Wu inside the records of the grand historian. Wu, Chu, Yue, Qi, Qin, and the rest had ceased to exist as independent actors in the same old way. Their rulers and ministers had become subjects for memory. Han historical writing gave that memory a form. Sima Qian did not merely gather names into a list. He arranged the past into annals, tables, treatises, hereditary houses, and biographies, creating one of the great structures of early Chinese historical thought. In that arrangement, the lives of rulers, ministers, generals, advisors, assassins, scholars, and strange men of talent could be placed beside the movement of dynasties. A life became meaningful because it showed how conduct, fate, talent, and political order met under pressure. Sun Tzu enters this grand record as a man whose military writings attracted King Helu of Wu. That is already a carefully shaped memory. The historian does not begin with Sun Tzu's parents, youth, teachers, or private formation. He begins with usefulness. A ruler reads the work, summons the man, tests him, and then employs him. The biography moves almost immediately from text to command, from written method to state service. In the Han imagination, this was enough to make the man historically legible. The palace test preserved by Sima Qian has therefore carried enormous weight. Without it, Sun Tzu would be even more difficult to hold as a biographical figure. The story gives him a ruler, a court, a trial, a doctrine of command, and an appointment. It also gives later readers a vivid explanation for why a military thinker deserved office. Yet the very vividness of the scene asks for care. Ancient biographies often preserve truth through shaped episodes, and the shape of an episode may reveal what later memory wanted the life to mean. In Sun Tzu's case, the meaning is discipline. Sima Qian's account does not portray him as a battlefield hero first. It shows him explaining orders, assigning responsibility, resisting royal interference, and proving that command requires consequences. The scene is severe, but it is also orderly. It makes Sun Tzu into the kind of man whose military knowledge is not merely clever but enforceable. A ruler may admire a text, but the test asks whether the text can govern bodies, rank, and obedience. Han readers would have understood the political seriousness of that question. The Han dynasty inherited the memory of a fractured world and ruled through an imperial order that had to balance military force, bureaucratic authority, court politics, and moral language. A general was useful and dangerous. A ruler needed men who could win, but also feared men whose command over armies might grow too strong. The story of Sun Tzu gave one answer to that tension. The good general was severe, disciplined, and effective, but his authority existed because the ruler entrusted him with a military task. That answer did not remove the danger. Early Chinese history is full of ministers and generals whose usefulness brought them close to suspicion. Wu Zixu had warned Fuchai and died under royal command. Fan Li, in later tradition, withdrew after helping Yue succeed. Han history itself knew the problem of powerful servants too well. Sima Qian's world had no reason to treat talent as harmless. Talent served the state, but it also changed the balance around the ruler who used it. The records of the grand historian preserved such tensions with unusual breadth. Sima Qian could admire ability without pretending that ability lived safely. He wrote of men who rose through insight, courage, persuasion, calculation, and endurance. Yet he also showed how courts could turn against them. In that larger historical vision, Sun Tzu belongs among figures whose value came from understanding a dangerous art better than ordinary men did. His biography is short, but its placement gives him a lasting position inside the moral archive of power. Archive is not only a place of documents, it is also a way of deciding what deserves to be remembered. The Han court and its scholars inherited writings, genealogies, court traditions, oral accounts, earlier chronicles, and texts whose origins were already layered. Some material may have been kept in official collections, some moved through private learning, some survived because families, schools, or specialists valued it. By the time Sima Qian wrote, the past had already passed through many kinds of hands. This is one reason the historian's work matters so greatly for Sun Tzu. The man himself is obscure, but once Sima Qian placed him in the record, he became harder to dismiss. A short biography in a major historical work could give durable standing to a figure whose other traces were thin. Later readers might debate details, chronology, authorship, and the relation between Sun Tzu and the received text, but they did so in a world where the Han historian had already given the name a formal historical home. Sima Qian's own life also gives weight to his writing, though it should not pull the chapter away from Sun Tzu. He served as court historian under Emperor Wu of Han and continued his work after suffering punishment and disgrace. His commitment to completing the records shaped how later generations viewed him, not simply as a compiler, but as a man who preserved memory under personal cost. That biographical fact does not make every tradition he recorded certain, but it explains why his historical voice came to carry such authority. When Sima Qian wrote about earlier men of talent, he often wrote with an awareness of how precarious service could be. Sun Wu's story, Wu Zishu's warnings, and the later fate of other advisors belong to a world Sima Qian understood emotionally as well as intellectually. A servant could be necessary to a ruler and still vulnerable to him. A man could see clearly and still be punished for the clarity. History, in Sima Qian's hands, often preserved the ache of that contradiction. The Sun Wu biography is brief enough that its silences remain loud. It does not tell us how Sun Wu died. It does not give a full career after Helu's appointment. It does not settle with certainty how the 13 chapters reached their received shape. It does not allow modern readers to follow him year by year. Instead, it gives a concentrated portrait: a man from Qi, a military text, King Helu's test, appointment in Wu, and success in the state's campaigns. The rest of the life recedes. Such brevity was not unusual in early historical writing. A biography did not always aim to give a complete personal record. It might preserve the decisive pattern of a life, the act, saying, office, loyalty, failure, or achievement through which the figure became memorable. Sun Wu's decisive pattern was command. He appears when command is tested, and he remains because later readers believe the test revealed the character of his art. The Han setting also changed how military texts were understood. Under Empire, works born from the age of rival states could be gathered into categories, studied as classics of technique, and placed within a wider tradition of governance. The state no longer looked like the world of Helu's Wu, yet the problems of war had not vanished. Frontiers remained, generals still had to be appointed, campaigns still cost grain, labor, and political confidence. A book on strategy could speak beyond the conditions that first formed it. Still, imperial preservation could soften the original violence of context. A text that once belonged to desperate interstate competition might become a work read by scholars, annotated by officials, and classified among military classics. This did not make it less serious, it made it more durable. The book no longer depended on one court's survival. It could live inside libraries, catalogues, commentaries, and educational traditions. The 13 chapters became part of how later China remembered the intelligence of its divided past. That process helped make Sun Tzu larger than Sun Wu. The remembered man remained tied to a sparse biography, but the name Sun Tzu grew with the authority of the text. As commentators returned to the chapters and rulers found them useful, the title Master Sun began to carry more weight than the recoverable personal life behind it. The person became less visible while the master became more powerful. This is one of the quiet transformations by which ancient fame is made. The historian's role in that transformation should not be underestimated. Without Sima Qian, Sun Wu might still have survived through the military text, but he would have stood with even less narrative form. Without the text, Sima Qian's anecdote might have remained one curious story among many. Together, the biography and the book strengthened each other. The text made the man important. The historian made the man memorable. Later tradition joined them so closely that separating them became difficult. Yet the difficulty is not a reason to abandon the story. It is the story. Sun Tzu was made through the meeting of a remembered general, a compact military treatise, a state's brief rise, a historian's arrangement, and centuries of readers who continue to find use in the name. The Han historians did not invent the need for strategy, and they did not create Wu's campaigns from nothing. They gave the surviving fragments a place inside a larger order of memory. After Sima Qian, Sun Tzu no longer belonged only to the age of Helu. He belonged to the written past. Scholars could quote him, generals could read him, cataloguers could classify him, and later commentators could argue with his sentences as if speaking across a table that time had lengthened but not broken. The next stage of his survival would come through those commentators, who gathered around the ancient voice and made the short book speak again in new ages of war, rule, and interpretation. Chapter 13. Commentators around an ancient voice. Cao Cao came to the art of war not only as a reader, but as a man who knew that command was never clean in practice. He lived many centuries after the world of Sun Tzu and King Helu in the late Han and Three Kingdoms age, when imperial authority had weakened and regional power once again decided the fate of states. That distance made him later than Sun Tzu, but not remote from the problems Sun Tzu described. Armies still had to be supplied. Rulers still misjudged danger. Generals still faced terrain, deception, morale, and the cost of moving men through uncertainty. His commentary became one of the important ways the old text continued to live. A commentary does more than explain difficult words. It chooses where emphasis falls, what kind of reader the text is imagined to have, and how ancient sentences should speak to later conditions. Cao Cao read Sun Tzu as someone who had governed men, fought campaigns, managed rivals, and understood that a military principle becomes real only when it passes through fear, ambition, shortage, and imperfect information. His notes helped turn the short book into a conversation between different ages of command. The base text remained compact. Its 13 chapters did not expand themselves into long case histories or elaborate narrative examples. That brevity invited later readers to lean toward it with their own experience. A sentence about deception could be read through one campaign in one century and another campaign in a later one. A line about terrain could be glossed by a commander who had crossed mountains, a scholar who had studied old maps, or an official who knew that a bad road could ruin the most elegant plan. The old voice endured partly because it left room around itself. Cao Cao's own life gave his reading a special authority. He was a warlord, statesman, poet, and founder of the power base that would become the state of Wei. He did not read strategy from the safety of abstraction. His world had seen the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the weakening of Han's central control, court violence, shifting alliances, and the long fragmentation that followed imperial failure. When such a man wrote on Sun Tzu, later readers could feel that the commentary had been tested by more than study. Still, commentary is not the same as obedience. Cao Cao did not merely kneel before the ancient text, he interpreted it. He sometimes clarified terse passages, sometimes adjusted the sense toward his own military understanding, and sometimes made the text easier for later readers to use. In doing so, he became part of Sun Tzu's afterlife. The ancient master remained the named source, but the commander-commentator helped decide how that source would be heard. Other commentators gathered around the text in later centuries. Du Mu, Li Quan, Mei Yao Chen, and others brought different concerns, periods, and habits of reading. Some approached the book with more literary care, some brought military examples, some worked within the scholarly culture of imperial China, where the old classics were not only preserved but layered with accumulated explanation. The result was not a single smooth interpretation. It was a tradition of reading, with each voice leaving marks beside the old words. This layering mattered because the art of war is easy to quote and difficult to exhaust. Its famous lines seem plain until one asks how they should be applied. To know the enemy and oneself sounds simple in isolation, but in actual government, neither the enemy nor the self is transparent. An enemy may hide weakness behind display. A ruler may believe his own court more loyal than it is. A commander may think he understands his troops until hunger, distance, or fear changes them. The commentary tradition kept reopening such sentences because the problems beneath them kept returning. Imperial China gave military classics a complex place. Civil learning often carried higher prestige than military life, especially in periods when the scholar-official ideal became dominant. Yet no dynasty could ignore war. Frontiers had to be defended, rebellions suppressed, campaigns planned, and generals judged. Military books therefore lived in a space that was sometimes honored, sometimes distrusted, and always necessary. Sun Tzu's text could be studied by men who admired elegant thought and by men who needed to keep armies alive. A reader in a later dynasty might meet the text through editions already shaped by commentaries. The old chapters stood at the center, but around them gathered explanations, notes, variant readings, and references to earlier events. The book became less like a single voice speaking from the 6th or 5th century BCE, and more like a room in which many disciplined readers had left their responses. This did not weaken the text, it gave it endurance. The work of commentary also protected against forgetting context, though it could never do so perfectly. A terse military sentence can become shallow when detached from the world of states, rulers, grain, spies, and terrain that made it necessary. Later commentators often pulled the words back toward examples and conditions. They asked what a line meant when a commander had to choose a route, when a city was hard to take, when a ruler wanted battle too soon, or when an enemy's apparent disorder might be bait. Interpretation returned the sentence to the weight of decision. Cao Cao's presence at the head of the tradition also reminds us that the reader of Sun Tzu could be morally complicated. He was not a gentle scholar preserving old wisdom for quiet admiration. He was a man of power whose career was bound to war, coercion, state building, and political necessity. That does not make his commentary less important, it makes it more revealing. Sun Tzu's ancient voice continued to matter because later men of force found it usable. There is a certain honesty in that continuity. The art of war did not survive as a harmless ornament. It survived because rulers and commanders believed it could help them act. The book's restraint, its suspicion of waste, and its attention to knowledge before movement did not remove it from the harsh world of power. They made it more valuable within that world. A doctrine that saves strength is most attractive to those who have strength to spend. At the same time, the commentators helped make the text more than a manual for immediate use. By preserving variant understandings and attaching explanation to difficult lines, they made the book a subject of study. It could be read slowly, compared, debated, memorized, and placed among the military classics. A work born from command became also a work of interpretation. Its afterlife depended on both soldiers and scholars, on men who needed action and men who preserved the language of action. The Song dynasty world, with its deep culture of scholarship and printing, gave such traditions wider stability. Printed editions allowed texts and commentaries to circulate differently from bamboo slips, hand copies, and fragile manuscripts. The physical form changed again. Once the old words entered print, they could travel with a steadiness earlier material forms had not allowed. Commentary became easier to standardize, preserve, and compare. The ancient text gained a new body. Yet every new body also changed the reading. Bamboo slips made the text a sequence of tied material pieces. Manuscripts made it dependent on copyists and collections. Printed editions made it more reproducible and more fixed in certain forms. Modern translations would later make it still more portable, sometimes at the cost of historical depth. Sun Tzu's survival was never only intellectual, it was also technological, institutional, and material. The commentators around Sun Tzu therefore stand as guardians and reshapers at the same time. They guarded the text by keeping it in circulation, but they reshaped it by deciding which meanings later readers would see first. Cao Cao's military experience, Du Mu's literary and historical learning, Li Kuan's explanations, Mei Yaochen's later scholarship, and other voices all helped create the Sun Tzu that later China inherited. The ancient master remained at the center, but the center was surrounded by centuries of careful attention. This long conversation also made Sun Tzu adaptable. A book with no commentators can become either frozen or forgotten. A book with too much loose quotation can become thin. The commentary tradition gave the art of war a middle path. It preserved the old sayings while allowing later readers to ask how they worked in new conditions. Each age could approach the text with its own wars, fears, institutions, and intellectual habits without cutting the thread to the past. After Cao Cao and the later commentators, Sun Tzu was no longer only a figure from Wu, nor only a name in Sima Qian, nor only the attributed author of 13 chapters. He had become a textual authority inside Chinese civilization. a voice read through other voices. That layered authority prepared the book for an even wider journey. Once texts can be copied, printed, explained, and treated as classics, they can cross boundaries their first world never imagined. From the shelves and commentaries of China, Sun Tzu would eventually move across languages, borders, armies, and empires. Chapter 14. Across borders, armies, and languages. Sun Tzu's journey beyond China began long after the world that produced him had disappeared. Wu, Chu, Yue, and the old warring states had become names inside histories, commentaries, and classical memory. The bamboo slips, manuscript copies, printed editions, and scholarly notes had carried the text through Chinese civilization before most of the outside world knew it existed. A book that began in the language of ancient courts and armies eventually entered a wider world through the slower and more delicate work of translation. Translation is never a simple crossing. A word that made sense inside one military culture may have no exact partner in another. A phrase shaped by the assumptions of early Chinese statecraft may look familiar to a foreign reader while carrying a different weight in its original setting. The translator does not only move language, he chooses emphasis, resolves ambiguity, and decides how much of the old world can be made visible to a new one. When the art of war crossed into European reading, it crossed through such choices. One of the major figures in that crossing was Joseph Marie Amiot, a French Jesuit missionary and scholar in Qing, China. In the 18th century, Amiot translated the text into French, giving European readers one of their earliest substantial openings into Sun Tzu's strategic thought. His work belonged to a wider movement in which Jesuits transmitted Chinese texts, histories, rituals, sciences, and court knowledge to Europe. The same networks that carried reports about astronomy, language, government, and philosophy also helped carry a compact manual on war. Amiot's translation appeared in a Europe with its own deep military traditions. European readers did not come to Sun Tzu as empty vessels. They already had Caesar, Vegetius, Machiavelli, Vauban, Frederick, and a long habit of thinking about siege, drill, logistics, rank, and battlefield command. For them, Sun Tzu was not simply a teacher arriving from nowhere. He was an unfamiliar voice entering a crowded room of already established military authorities. His difference lay in tone as much as content. The book's restraint could feel striking. European military writing often included close attention to formations, weapons, sieges, fortifications, and the technical arrangement of forces. Sun Tzu certainly cared about practical conditions, but the text that reached European readers placed unusual emphasis on calculation, deception, indirectness, morale, terrain, and the breaking of enemy plans before costly battle. It did not read like a celebration of force. It read like a warning about how easily force could be wasted. That difference helped the book travel, though not always with its full context intact. A reader far from ancient China could recognize certain principles quickly. Know the enemy, avoid needless struggle, use deception, attack plans, preserve strength, move according to advantage. Such ideas seemed portable because they spoke to recurring conditions of conflict. Yet portability has a danger of its own. The easier a sentence is to carry into another world, the easier it is to detach it from the world that first gave it meaning. Printed editions made the crossing more durable. Unlike bamboo slips or hand-copied manuscripts, printed books could circulate among larger communities of readers and could be reissued, excerpted, translated again, and placed beside other works. Once Sun Tzu entered European print culture, he no longer depended only on Chinese scholarly transmission. He gained new chains of survival with new eras, new emphases, and new audiences. The text was preserved by being changed in the minds that received it. Military readers outside China often approached Sun Tzu through the needs of their own age. Some found in him a language of economy and indirectness. Some valued his attention to intelligence and preparation. Others reduced him to maxims, because maxims travel more easily than historical understanding. This is one of the recurrent fates of ancient texts. They are admired most widely at the very point where they are most likely to be simplified. A line that once belonged to a world of rival states, grain levies, royal courts, envoys, spies, and difficult terrain might become a general rule for any contest. That generalizing was not always false. Sun Tzu's strength lies partly in the way his language reaches beyond the details of ancient Chinese warfare. But when the details vanish entirely, the text becomes thinner. Strategy without its material setting can begin to sound like cleverness without cost. Across borders, Sun Tzu also entered comparison. European readers measured him against their own classics of war. Later readers placed him beside Clausewitz, even though the two works belonged to very different worlds and asked different kinds of questions. Clausewitz wrote in the aftermath of the Napoleonic era, with modern states, mass armies, and European political philosophy behind him. Sun Tzu came from a pre-imperial and early imperial Chinese tradition of courtly calculation, interstate rivalry, and disciplined advantage. To compare them can be useful, but only when the distance between them is not erased. The appeal of Sun Tzu outside China grew because his text seemed to speak before the noise of battle. It asked about the ruler's judgment, the commander's clarity, the enemy's condition, the value of information, and the danger of exhaustion. These concerns remained meaningful in many military cultures. Armies changed, weapons changed, states changed, but uncertainty did not disappear. Leaders still had to decide with incomplete knowledge. They still had to distinguish confidence from delusion. They still had to ask whether the cost of action would leave victory worth having. Modern military education eventually gave Sun Tzu a regular place in many reading lists. Cadets, officers, strategists, and scholars encountered him as part of a broader canon of strategic thought. In that setting, the ancient Chinese text became one voice among several, sometimes used to balance more direct, battle-centered approaches to war. Its value lay not in providing ready-made answers, but in training a habit of attention. Look before moving, understand relation before force, disturb the enemy's mind before meeting the enemy's body. Yet, institutional reading can simplify as much as preserve. A military academy may assign Sun Tzu because he is famous, and a reader may remember only a few portable sentences. The shorter the lesson extracted from an old book, the more careful the reader must be. Sun Tzu's 13 chapters are compact, but they are not shallow. Their brevity requires attention to relation among ideas. Spies, terrain, deception, discipline, and economy belong together. To separate them too completely is to break the mechanism of the thought. Beyond military institutions, Sun Tzu moved into politics, business, sports, negotiation, and popular self-help. This later journey enlarged his name beyond anything the old world could have imagined. A text once concerned with rulers and commanders became a guide for executives, coaches, entrepreneurs, and private readers trying to think about competition. That expansion made Sun Tzu globally familiar, but it also carried him far from the violence, administration, and state danger that gave his words their first seriousness. The business reception of Sun Tzu is especially revealing. Markets are not battlefields, and customers are not enemy armies, though modern language often borrows military terms for competition. When readers use Sun Tzu to think about planning, timing, knowledge, and restraint, the borrowing can be thoughtful. When they reduce him to a set of aggressive slogans, the old text is almost turned against itself. The book that warned against waste becomes a decoration for ambition. Still, the very breadth of Sun Tzu's reception shows something genuine about the text. It speaks to conflict before conflict becomes visible. It teaches that success is often prepared in advance, that information matters more than noise, that strength poorly used becomes weakness, and that the best decision may be the one that makes a costly decision unnecessary. These ideas can survive travel because they rest on patterns of human judgment, even when the institutions around them change. Translation also brought new misunderstandings around the figure of Sun Tzu himself. In many modern readings, the uncertainty of his biography disappears. The book is presented as if a fully visible ancient general sat down and wrote one polished manual whose path to the present was clean and direct. That version is easier to market, but it is less faithful to the historical record. The real story is more interesting. A remembered Sun Tzu, a text shaped by early Chinese military thought, Han preservation, commentary, translation, and many later acts of reading. Joseph Marie Amiot could not have controlled what Europe and the wider world would eventually do with Sun Tzu. No translator can govern the afterlife of a text once it enters a new language. His work opened a passage, and through that passage came admiration, simplification, study, misuse, comparison, and genuine understanding in unequal measure. The ancient book gained a larger audience while losing some of the protection that comes from being read inside its own tradition. That is the condition of every classic that travels far. It must be loosened from its first world in order to reach new readers. But if it is loosened too completely, it becomes a shadow of itself. Sun Tzu survived the crossing because enough of the original force remained visible. The suspicion of waste, the attention to knowledge, the disciplined use of deception, the ruler's responsibility, and the commander's need to think before movement. Even in translation, those concerns did not vanish. By the time Sun Tzu had crossed borders, armies, and languages, he had become more than a Chinese military classic. He had become part of the global vocabulary of strategy. The name could now appear in war colleges, diplomatic discussions, corporate shelves, and casual quotations far removed from Wu and Chu. But the farther the name traveled, the more easily the man and his world could be forgotten. That widening fame leads into the modern imagination, where Sun Tzu became at once more famous, more useful, and more vulnerable to being reduced to a few polished lines. Chapter 15. The Strategist in the Modern Imagination. Sun Tzu became most famous in the centuries farthest from his own. That is one of the strange patterns in the life of a classic. A short military text formed in the memory of ancient Chinese warfare passed through bamboo, manuscript, commentary, print, translation, military study, political reading, and popular quotation, until the name Sun Tzu could be recognized by people who knew almost nothing about Wu, Chu, Yue, King Helu, Wu Zishu, or the broken world of the Eastern Zhou. The farther the book traveled, the larger the name became. Modern readers often meet Sun Tzu as a voice of clean strategy. He appears in a few memorable lines, usually detached from the old states that gave those lines their first urgency. The ancient ruler becomes a leader. The enemy becomes a competitor. The army becomes an organization. The campaign becomes a negotiation, a market, a career, or a private struggle of will. This wide usefulness is part of the reason the text survived so powerfully, but it also changes the book. A work about state violence, discipline, spies, supply, and survival can become a pocket manual for ambition. Military institutions gave Sun Tzu a more serious modern home. War colleges and strategic studies programs placed him among the writers whose works helped officers think beyond the immediate mechanics of weapons. He could be read beside other strategic voices, not because he answered the same questions in the same way, but because he forced attention toward preparation, intelligence, deception, morale, and the relation between political purpose and military cost. The ancient setting was different, but the need to think before action remained familiar. There was something attractive in his refusal to worship battle. Modern war had become capable of destruction on a scale the ancient world could not imagine. Yet the intellectual problem of waste remained. The commander who spends lives, material, time, and political trust without clear purpose is still failing, even if the instruments have changed. Sun Tzu's suspicion of prolonged conflict, his attention to knowing the enemy, and his preference for breaking resistance before the most costly collision could speak to readers who had seen how ruinous war could become when movement outran judgment. 20th century political and military struggles gave the text new audiences. Mao Zedong's reading of Chinese strategic traditions belongs carefully in this field. Mao did not simply repeat Sun Tzu, and the revolutionary wars of the 20th century were far removed from the courtly interstate world of Wu and Chu. Yet ideas of indirect struggle, patient preparation, enemy exhaustion, political will, intelligence, and the long shaping of conditions could find echoes between ancient military thought and modern revolutionary strategy. The connection is not a straight line, It is a later reader drawing from an older reservoir. Mao's own military writings placed war inside politics, population, ideology, terrain, and time. In that wider setting, ancient Chinese strategic habits could be remembered not as museum objects, but as part of a living vocabulary of struggle. The older texts concern with knowing the enemy and oneself, avoiding strength, striking weakness, and shaping conditions before direct confrontation had natural appeal in situations where a weaker force faced a stronger one. Sun Tzu had written, or was remembered as writing, for rulers and generals. Modern revolutionary readers found in him a language for asymmetry. Asymmetry is one of the reasons Sun Tzu remained compelling. His book does not assume that victory belongs automatically to the larger force. Size matters, resources matter, and state strength matters. But judgment can alter the meaning of size. A smaller army may avoid the enemy's strength. A weaker state may use terrain, deception, speed, alliance, or intelligence to disturb a stronger one. That thought appealed to modern readers who lived in worlds of unequal power, whether military, political, or institutional. The danger is that asymmetry can become a romantic idea when detached from cost. Sun Tzu's world did not make cleverness a substitute for reality. It asked the commander to know conditions more accurately than the enemy did. The weaker side could not win by slogans. It needed discipline, information, timing, and the patience to refuse battles that vanity desired. Modern readers sometimes remember the brilliance of indirection and forget the administrative severity behind it. Business culture eventually carried Sun Tzu into a very different landscape. Editions of The Art of War appeared with covers, subtitles, and introductions aimed at executives, entrepreneurs, managers, negotiators, and anyone who wanted to think of competition as strategy. There is a reason this happened. Markets involve uncertainty, rivals, timing, information, perception, and the danger of waste. A reader looking for language about advantage could find sentences in Sun Tzu that seemed surprisingly adaptable. Yet the business Sun Tzu is often the thinnest Sun Tzu. The old book can be reduced to polished commands about winning, defeating competitors, hiding intentions, and dominating situations. When that happens, the ancient text is pulled away from its more disciplined concerns. It was never merely a handbook for aggression. It was a study of cost, restraint, information, command responsibility, and the danger of fighting badly. A business reader who takes only the language of victory may miss the deeper warning about waste. Popular quotation culture made the reduction stronger. A few lines became famous because they were easy to remember and easy to place almost anywhere. The more a sentence travels alone, the less protection the surrounding chapter gives it. A line about knowing the enemy loses weight when separated from spies, terrain, discipline, state capacity, and the fear of prolonged war. A line about deception can become shallow when removed from the heavy responsibility of command. The text's compactness made it portable, and its portability made it vulnerable. Still, the modern imagination did not invent Sun Tzu's power. It recognized something already present. The book speaks with unusual clarity about the mental side of conflict. It teaches that action begins in perception, that enemies must be studied before being opposed, that one's own condition must be understood without flattery, and that victory is not always found where noise is greatest. These lessons are not bound to bronze weapons or ancient banners, even though they were first shaped in such a world. Their reach is real because human judgment remains fallible. Modern military readers often value Sun Tzu because he gives language to restraint. Many strategic traditions contain heroic pressure toward decisive battle. Sun Tzu asks whether battle is necessary, whether the enemy's plan can be broken first, whether alliances can be disrupted, whether position can be altered, whether waiting may serve better than movement. This does not make him peaceful. It makes him severe in a different way. He does not dislike force because force is morally troubling. He distrusts force when force is badly used. That severity can be easy to miss when the text becomes inspirational. Sun Tzu is not comforting in the ordinary sense. He asks rulers and commanders to be clear, unsentimental, observant, and difficult to deceive. He asks them to treat disorder as dangerous, ignorance as costly, and pride as a threat to the state that feels it. Modern readers may admire the elegance of the sentences, but the world inside them is disciplined and hard. A commander who fails to know enough may destroy men through his own confusion. The modern habit of turning Sun Tzu into a universal sage also obscures the uncertainty around the man himself. Many editions present a smooth biography. An ancient general named Sun Tzu wrote a book, served a king, won battles, and left wisdom behind. The fuller story is less tidy. Sun Wu stands in tradition. Sima Qian preserves a powerful anecdote. The art of war passes through textual history. Sun Bin complicates the Sun name. Commentators shape the reading. Translators widen the audience. The modern Sun Tzu is the result of all these layers. That layered story is more valuable than the simplified one. It shows how a text becomes famous, not once, but repeatedly. Sun Tzu became useful to Heliu's Wu in tradition, useful to Han historians as a figure of command, useful to commentators as an ancient authority, useful to translators as a Chinese strategic classic, useful to officers as a book of military judgment, and useful to modern readers as a language of competition. Each use preserved him and altered him. A famous ancient text often survives by allowing later ages to misunderstand it just enough to keep reading it. That does not mean every modern use is false. It means that fame is uneven. Some readers return to the old context and find the harder intelligence of the work. Others take a line, a phrase, or a posture. The name spreads in both ways. Sun Tzu's modern life includes careful scholarship and shallow quotation, serious military study and decorative business language, historical attention and almost mythic simplification. In this broad modern reception, the title Master Sun begins to float free of the man Sun Wu. He becomes less a figure from Qi or Wu and more a symbol of strategic cleverness itself. The symbol is not useless. Symbols help cultures remember, but they can also flatten the person and the world behind them. Sun Tzu did not emerge from a timeless realm of wisdom. He emerged from states that feared one another, courts that punished bad counsel, rulers who counted grain, and armies that could ruin the people they were meant to protect. The modern imagination prefers clean lessons. Ancient history rarely gives them cleanly. What Sun Tzu offers instead is a disciplined way of thinking under pressure. Understand the conditions, preserve strength, disturb the enemy's plans, distrust appearances, refuse waste, and remember that victory can damage the victor if it is badly pursued. Those principles remain readable because they do not depend entirely on the weapons of one age, but they become truer, not weaker, when placed back inside the old world that made them necessary. By the time Sun Tzu reached modern shelves, classrooms, war colleges, speeches, and boardrooms, his name had traveled far beyond the campaigns of Wu. The man himself had become difficult to recover, while the book had become easier to quote than ever. That tension leads into the final movement of the story. After the battles, after the states, after the historians, commentators, translators, and modern readers, something still remains. A short work in 13 chapters, an uncertain ancient master, and a way of thinking about conflict that survived because every age found new dangers to measure against it. Chapter 16. What remained after the battles? Bamboo outlasted kingdoms in ways no ruler could have expected. The state of Wu rose, frightened Chu, misjudged Yue, and disappeared into the wider history of China. Chu endured beyond humiliation. Yue had its own triumph and its own fading, and the long world of rival courts eventually gave way to empire. Yet the short work attached to Sun Tzu crossed those endings with a strange durability. It did not hold territory. It did not command soldiers. It survived by being copied, studied, buried, recovered, argued over, translated, and read again. Sun Wu, the traditional man behind the name, remains partly hidden. He stands in Sima Qian's account as a figure from Qi who served King Heliu of Wu, demonstrated command in a severe palace test, and helped make Wu's military power memorable. Beyond that, the record thins. There is no full year-by-year career, no clear account of his final days, no private voice preserved in letters or reflection. The historian reaches for him and finds a strong outline at one point, then a widening silence around it. That silence did not prevent the name from growing. Sun Tzu became larger because the text carrying his title remained useful. The 13 chapters did not require later readers to know every detail of the man's life before they could feel the pressure of his thought. They asked rulers and commanders to calculate before acting, to preserve strength, to know the enemy and themselves, to treat prolonged war as danger, to understand terrain, to use information carefully, and to distrust the appearance of things. A life may vanish into uncertainty while a pattern of judgment stays unusually clear. King Heilu belongs to that survival because he gave the traditional Sun Wu a court. Without Heilu, the biography would lack its decisive setting. The ambitious ruler of Wu becomes the figure who hears of the military writings, summons the strategist, tests him, and accepts his severity. He represents the ruler who wants more than noble courage, he wants method. In the remembered story, Heilu's court becomes the place where written strategy must become command, and where command must prove that it can stand even against royal discomfort. Wu Zishu belongs just as strongly, though in a darker way. His exile from Chu, his service to Wu, his role in the campaigns against the state that destroyed his family, and his later warnings to Fuchai show the peril of counsel near power. He saw that enemies could wait, that injury could mature into policy, and that a ruler's pride could make accurate advice sound offensive. His fate gave the Sun Tzu tradition one of its living commentaries. Knowledge does not save a state if the ruler refuses to hear it. Fuchai and Gujan carry the lesson further. Fuchai inherited strength and treated it as more secure than it was. Gujan endured defeat and converted humiliation into preparation. Between them lies one of the sharpest reversals in early Chinese memory. Wu had known how to rise, but Yu learned how to wait. Strategy did not belong only to the victor. It belonged to whoever could read conditions more patiently and act when the balance had changed. This is why the fall of Wu does not contradict Sun Tzu's fame. It deepens the world around it. The state associated with his traditional service demonstrated both the power of disciplined strategy and the danger of forgetting its principles after success. It showed that a great campaign can humble an enemy without securing the future, that an advisor can be right and still be destroyed, and that a defeated rival can become more focused than the ruler who spared him. Ancient history rarely lets victory remain simple. Sima Qian then carried Sun Wu into historical memory. He did not give him a full modern biography, but he gave him a scene, a ruler, a test, and a place in the long record of Chinese talent and power. Through the records of the grand historian, Sun Wu became more than the shadow behind a military text. He became a remembered man, even if the memory was compressed and shaped. The historian's brief account gave the later world a figure to set beside the book. Sun Bin complicated and enriched that inheritance. His separate military tradition showed that the Sun name did not belong to one easy line of thought. The recovery of texts from Yingquishan reminded modern scholars that early Chinese military writing was layered, material, and more various than simple legend allows. Bamboo slips pulled the discussion away from pure speculation and placed it beside objects that had passed through ancient hands. The story of Sun Tzu became less tidy and therefore more historical. Cao Cao and later commentators gave the text another kind of life. They did not leave the 13 chapters alone, sealed behind reverence. They read, explained, sharpened, argued, and applied. Their commentaries show that an ancient classic survives by attracting serious attention from later minds. Each note beside the text became a small act of preservation. Each interpretation also changed what future readers would notice first. Translation carried Sun Tzu farther still. Joseph Marie Armiot and later translators opened passages between Chinese strategic thought and readers who belonged to different military, political, and intellectual worlds. In translation, the text became more available and more vulnerable. Its sentences could reach new armies, scholars, officers, executives, and ordinary readers, but they could also be cut loose from the old states, old courts, and old costs that made them severe. A classic gains distance by travel, and distance always asks something in return. Modern fame completed the transformation. Sun Tzu became a name for strategy itself, sometimes studied carefully, sometimes quoted thinly, sometimes treated as if he had written a manual for every contest in human life. War colleges read him beside other strategic thinkers. Political movements found language in him for asymmetry and patience. Business culture borrowed his authority for competition. Private readers used his sentences as tools for decision. The old master became global, and in becoming global, he became easier to misunderstand. Still, misunderstanding is not the whole modern story. Many readers continue to return to the harder Sun Tzu, the one concerned with cost, knowledge, discipline, restraint, timing, and the ruler's responsibility for what war consumes. That Sun Tzu is not a maker of clever slogans. He is a voice from a world where bad judgment could empty fields, weaken states, embitter enemies, and destroy the very power it meant to enlarge. His clarity remains because the danger he studied did not vanish when weapons changed. What remained after the battles then was not one thing. A name remained. A book remained. A set of questions remained. How much does victory cost? What does the enemy know? What does the ruler refuse to know about himself? When does movement serve the state, and when does it merely satisfy pride? How can force be prepared so carefully that less of it has to be spent? These questions gave the 13 chapters their long life. The figure of Sun Tzu stands at the meeting point of certainty and uncertainty. It is certain that the art of war became one of the most influential military texts ever transmitted. It is certain that early Chinese warfare, statecraft, and manuscript culture shaped the world from which it came. It is certain that later historians, commentators, and translators helped build the Sun Tzu known today. The private man remains less certain. His outline is visible but not complete. There is no need to force him into a sharper shape than the evidence allows. Some ancient figures survive as full careers. Others survive as names attached to decisive works, remembered scenes, and the judgment of later centuries. Sun Tzu belongs to the second kind. The incompleteness around him does not empty his story. It gives the story its proper distance. The distance of bamboo slips, old courts, lost campaigns, and a text that remained when the men who first used it were gone. At the end of the history, the most striking thing about Sun Tzu may be the restraint inside his fame. He is remembered as a master of war, yet his most durable teaching warns against war used carelessly. He is quoted as a strategist of victory, yet his book keeps returning to preparation, knowledge, and the avoidance of unnecessary cost. He is treated as a voice of power, but the power he describes depends on patience before action. The general who won wars before they began became famous not because he loved battle, but because he understood how much battle could spend. The old states have long since receded. Wu no longer gathers armies against Chu. Yue no longer waits beside Wu's ambition. King Helu, Fu Chai, Gojian, Wu Zishu, Fan Li, Sima Chen, Cao Cao, Amiot, and the many unnamed copyists and readers have all taken their places in the long chain of transmission. What remains is the small written body of the work, 13 chapters, spare in form, severe in thought, and still asking each reader to pause before motion. From that remaining text, the story can now soften into its final quiet, where the battles have passed, and the old words rest after their long journey.